Welcome to Pripyat, a model Soviet city with a glowing personality. Pripyat wasn't just a city, it was the city, a glowing jewel in the crown of Soviet atomic ambition. And by glowing, yes, we do mean that in multiple ways. Hello travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this. And hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Founded in 1970, Pripyat was built from the radioactive ground up as a showcase for Soviet progress. This was no crumbling peasant village. No, Pripyat was a luxury capsule in the USSR's time travel vision of the future. Imagine the Jetsons, if they all wore grey, lined up for cabbage, and powered their flying car with uranium. It had modern architecture, bright apartment blocks, and indoor plumbing that mostly worked. By Soviet standards, it was a utopia, assuming your idea of paradise comes with state surveillance and mandatory Lenin portraits in every hallway. The city's crown jewel, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, just a few kilometers away. Yes, the same one. Back in the day, nuclear power was the future, and the USSR was betting big, real big. Nuclear energy was the glittering unicorn of Soviet dreams. It promised limitless electricity, industrial growth, and a future where everyone got to microwave their dinner without blowing a fuse. Never mind that the technology was rushed. Corners were cut like an overcooked beet, and the manuals were basically written in optimistic lies. Still, Pripyat was the reward for those who kept the great Soviet machine humming. The city was home to scientists, engineers, factory workers, teachers, nurses, and their children. And unlike much of the rest of the USSR, it had some pretty sweet perks. Fully stocked grocery stores, well, by 1980s Soviet standards, modern hospitals, music schools, bookstores, movie theaters, and what can only be described as a Soviet version of Disneyland, with slightly more concrete and slightly less Mickey Mouse. Instead of, "It's a small world," you got, "It's a slightly radioactive world, comrade." The average age of a Pripyat resident was just 26. It was a young, energetic city, full of idealists, workers, and people who genuinely believed in the power of atoms and progress. The city was planned with precision: wide boulevards, green parks, public transport, and endless grey buildings that looked identical, but had different numbers, which is how you knew you weren't lost. There were sports complexes, swimming pools, and even a cultural palace where you could attend riveting performances like the Joy of Grain Production, a Soviet ballet. It was a place where children played in playgrounds with metal slides that got way too hot in the summer sun, and teenagers snuck off to hang out near the Pripyat River, totally unaware that their future was ticking away like a very quiet Geiger counter. People walked their dogs, complained about the price of cabbage, and went to work every day under the shadow of the giant concrete monument to human hubris just outside town. And the best part? The Chernobyl plant paid well. If you were a nuclear engineer, you were living the high life by Soviet standards. Anyway, you had a television, a refrigerator, maybe even a second pair of shoes. You were practically bourgeois. In a country where your neighbors might still be herding goats by flashlight, this was luxury. Of course, no one really talked about the downsides of living next to a nuclear reactor. The occasional warning signs about safe zones or drills where school children had to wear gas masks were brushed off as just a precaution. If anything, the plant was treated like a benevolent factory, a place where the future was being forged one glowing isotope at a time. The power plant itself had 4 reactors running by 1983, with plans for more. It generated electricity not just for Pripyat, but for millions of people across Ukraine and beyond. It was also, quietly, generating problems, design flaws, ignored warnings, and a culture of secrecy that would one day become radioactive headlines. But in April of 1986, none of that mattered yet. Life in Pripyat was calm, organized, and humming with Soviet pride. You could ride a bus to work past neat apartment blocks and propaganda billboards declaring, "Nuclear energy is our bright future," a slogan that aged like milk in a sunbeam. The sky was blue, the streets were clean, the shops were stocked with goods, mostly pickled, and if there was a faint metallic taste in the back of your throat, well, maybe that was just patriotism or something else. The good news? You're alive. The bad news? So are the isotopes. Welcome to Pripyat. Hope you brought a dosimeter. It was just past 1 a.m. on April 26, 1986, and while most of Pripyat slept soundly, dreaming of beet soup and slightly damp spring picnics, inside Reactor No. 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, a small group of engineers and operators were about to play an extremely dangerous game of nuclear Jenga. Spoiler alert, they lost. Now this wasn't sabotage. This wasn't even intentional negligence. No, this was the deadly kind of stupidity that comes wrapped in a lab coat and backed by a clipboard. What happened wasn't a bomb or an attack. It was a test, a safety test, which is the cruelest irony of all, because nothing screams safety quite like melting a nuclear reactor into radioactive goo. So what were they trying to do? Let's break it down in human language, not reactor speak. The test was meant to see if the turbines could keep producing electricity for a short time after the reactor shut down. Think of it as trying to use your fan after you've unplugged it, just coasting on momentum. In theory, this was smart. In practice, it was like asking your microwave to keep working after someone kicks it down a flight of stairs. Here's where things get messy. The test had been postponed earlier in the day and rescheduled for late at night, because nothing bad ever happens during a midnight shift. A less experienced night crew took over, and they were now flying blind with a half-written checklist, flawed reactor design, and a healthy fear of upsetting Moscow. That's a bad cocktail. To prepare for the test, they reduced the reactor's power level. Sounds fine, right? Except this reactor, the RBMK, had a fatal design quirk. It was more unstable at low power. It was like trying to drive a car that randomly accelerates when you tap the brakes. And this crew, they were tapping the brakes, pulling the wheel, and yelling, "Comrade, it is probably fine." As they lowered the power, something called xenon poisoning kicked in. Not the sci-fi kind, the nuclear kind. Xenon is a gas that absorbs neutrons and slows the nuclear reaction. So now the reactor wasn't just unstable, it was groggy, sluggish, and full of self-doubt. The operators, worried the test would be invalid at such low power, tried to fix it. And how do you fix a sleepy reactor? You pull out the control rods that are supposed to keep it stable. Genius. They yanked most of the rods out of the core. This is not unlike removing the brakes from a truck, because it's not going downhill fast enough. They were now running an unstable reactor at an extremely low power level, with almost no ability to stop it. Then, like a cherry on top of a radioactive sundae, they turned off several safety systems to prevent them from interrupting the test. You know, just in case something safe tried to happen. At 1 hour 23 minutes and 4 seconds AM, the test began. Instantly, the power levels spiked wildly. Panicking, the operators hit the emergency shutdown button. You'd think that would help, but the RBMK reactor, never one to handle criticism well, responded like an insulted aristocrat in a French play. It dramatically self-destructed. See, the shutdown rods were tipped with graphite, which briefly increased reactivity as they were inserted. It's like putting out a fire with gasoline-soaked marshmallows. Within seconds, power surged far beyond design limits. Water turned to steam, fuel channels ruptured, and then, boom. And 1 hour 23 minutes and 40 seconds, Reactor No. 4 exploded. Not once, but twice. The second blast ripped the reactor open, blowing the 200-ton upper biological shield, ironically named, into the sky. It rained radioactive debris, graphite, uranium, isotopes. A chemical fire ignited that would burn for days. To be clear, this wasn't a nuclear explosion like Hiroshima. It was a thermal explosion, a violent blast caused by heat and steam pressure. But the radioactive aftermath, that was very real, and very much not covered in the training manual. Inside the control room, chaos reigned. The engineers didn't even know the reactor had exploded. One operator, confused by the data, asked, "Is the reactor intact?" Another replied, "Apparently, that's Soviet for we're doomed." But let's not say it out loud. Now here's your first actual survival tip. Don't be there. Really? That's it. Don't work the midnight shift at a nuclear plant during a safety test, where the safety systems are turned off. If your time machine drops you off in Soviet Ukraine in the 1980s, and someone offers you a job at Chernobyl, politely decline. Say you're allergic to plutonium, or heights, or responsibility. Because if you are there, There's not much you can do. The people in the control room were exposed to lethal doses of radiation almost immediately. Some died in days, others suffered for weeks. Their uniforms had to be buried in concrete. They were radioactive. And the terrifying part? Outside the plant, no one knew. Pripyat slept peacefully. The dogs barked, the river flowed, a blue glow, Cherenkov radiation, lit up the ruins of the reactor, like some post-apocalyptic birthday candle. People would come out to look at it. To them, it was just pretty. But this chapter isn't about the aftermath. That's later. This is the explosion. The moment when a safety test turned into a history lesson carved in isotopes and hubris. Remember, the reactor wasn't attacked. It wasn't sabotaged. It was just told to do something it couldn't. It panicked, sped up, and exploded in a fit of radioactive rage. And that's very Soviet science. It was around 1:24 a.m. when the first people in Pripyat heard it. A deep, echoing boom that rattled windows and jolted more than a few sleepers out of their dreams of Lenin and sausage lines. Some thought it was a sonic boom. Others assumed the plant had vented steam. An occasional, unnerving but explainable event. But anyone who looked toward the Chernobyl nuclear power plant saw something that was very much not routine. Rising above reactor No. 4 was a column of blue light, otherworldly, bright, and almost beautiful. People would later describe it as shimmering, glowing, almost magical. The kind of glow that if it were a nightclub would get 5 stars on Soviet Yelp. The scientific name for this eerie glow is Cherenkov radiation, and while it's pretty to look at, it's also a neon sign that says, "Run, your DNA is melting." But run, they did not. No, many did the opposite. They went outside. They climbed onto bridges, rooftops, and balconies. They watched in awe. Some even brought their kids. Look, Misha, a surprise fireworks show from the People's Glorious Reactor. It was like a Soviet version of New Year's Eve. But instead of confetti, it was radioactive graphite. And yes, graphite was everywhere. Chunks of it, black, metallic, steaming, lay scattered around the plant grounds. Some pieces were so hot with radiation they could deliver a lethal dose in seconds. But what did the workers on site do? They picked it up. One man allegedly tossed a piece back and forth in his hands like it was a rock he found on a hiking trail. Another asked, "Is this charcoal?" "No, comrade. That's the core of a nuclear reactor, and your hands now glow in the dark." Then came the first responders. Fire brigades from Pripyat were dispatched within minutes. They thought it was just a standard electrical fire. Nothing unusual for an industrial complex. No one told them it was a nuclear reactor that had exploded. That's classified. What wasn't classified? The sky was shimmering like a rave in hell, and the air smelled off. Burning chemicals, ozone, and something else. Something metallic, unnatural, like licking a battery while standing in a microwave. When the firefighters arrived, they were greeted not just by flames but by the kind of devastation that doesn't make sense. The core was open to the air. Radioactive steam was pouring out in waves, but they didn't have protective suits. No lead aprons, no dosimeters, just standard cotton uniforms and the bravery of people who weren't told they were walking into a slow-motion death sentence. One by one, they started climbing to the roof of the turbine hall, hoping to put out fires and prevent further damage. Instead, they walked straight into the heart of the radiation. The metal beneath their boots was so hot, it melted their soles. Some collapsed from the heat. Others vomited on the spot. One man reportedly began bleeding from his gums within minutes, but they kept going. That's the kind of heroism that makes your stomach turn. Not from disgust, but from the sheer blind courage of people who thought they were stopping a fire, not absorbing enough radiation to make their bones hum. Back in the city, nobody was told to shelter in place. No sirens, no evacuation. People stood on bridges and rooftops. There's an infamous story of the Bridge of Death, where dozens watched the glowing inferno. Nearly all of them were later reported to have died of radiation-related illnesses. One witness remembered her husband coming home from the plant with his face as red as a lobster, his eyes bloodshot, his skin hot to the touch. "It's just sunburn," he said, "at night, in April. If you're running toward the glowing object because it's pretty, congratulations, you've already failed." But again, you can't blame the people. They weren't told, they didn't know. No one handed them a manual titled "So Your Local Nuclear Plant Just Exploded," a survival guide. They were lied to, over and over. Even the hospital that treated the early victims didn't know they were dealing with radiation exposure. Doctors touched contaminated clothing with bare hands. Nurses wiped up radioactive vomit with towels and tossed them in regular laundry bins. And let's not forget the birds. Yes, the birds, the first silent victims. By morning, the trees around Reactor 4 were littered with the bodies of crows and sparrows who flew through the radiation cloud. It turns out feathers are no match for gamma rays. The Red Forest, so named because the pine trees literally turned reddish-orange from radiation burn, was the kind of environmental horror you usually only read about in apocalyptic fiction. All this within the first 6 hours. The fire would rage for days, the radiation would rise, but in these first hours, the disaster was invisible. No flames in the streets, no mass panic, just a surreal blue light, a few rumors, and a city unknowingly marinating in the worst nuclear disaster in history. So survival tip number 2, if there's a blue glow in the sky, and men in uniform are walking toward it without panic, you panic. And if a guy with a shovel is coughing up his lungs and someone says, it's probably just a cold, start sprinting. Ideally, in the opposite direction of anything with Cyrillic letters and a cooling tower. The disaster had begun. The worst was yet to come. But for the people of Pripyat and the firefighters who arrived thinking it was just another late-night call, it was already far too late. So the reactor has exploded. Radiation is spewing into the air. First responders are collapsing. Birds are falling from the sky. And how does the Soviet government respond? By taking a deep breath and whispering softly into the void. If we don't talk about it, it didn't happen. That, in essence, was the Soviet disaster response plan. Not evacuate, not warn, not even acknowledge. Just sit very still, keep your facial expression neutral, and hope no one notices the glowing crater in the middle of your energy complex. It's like waking up to find your kitchen on fire and deciding the best solution is to water the plants. In the Soviet Union, public image was everything. The state didn't make mistakes. The Communist Party was infallible. Therefore, by the laws of ideology, a nuclear reactor could not have exploded. So even though plant officials knew by sunrise that something had gone horribly wrong, being a polite euphemism, for you've just irradiated an entire region, they waited, they hesitated, they covered their ears and yelled, LA, 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 in bureaucratic Russian. Pripyat, the city practically within arm's reach of Reactor 4, was not evacuated for 36 hours. That's a day and a half of regular life in a radioactive zone. Children went to school, parents went to work. People stood in lines for bread while invisible gamma rays strolled right through them like uninvited guests. Some folks even held outdoor weddings that day. Imagine your cake tasting a little metallic and the birds dying in mid-air and still thinking, must be spring. And what were the officials doing during this time? Having meetings, dozens of them, glorious, dull, finger-pointing meetings, where no one wanted to say the word explosion out loud in case it got back to Moscow. One bureaucrat famously declared, "There is no reason to spread panic." This from a man standing within sight of a radioactive inferno. You see, in the USSR, panic wasn't just discouraged, it was treasonous. Causing alarm could be interpreted as undermining the state. So instead of alarm bells, the government offered what it does best: silence, misdirection, and heavy doses of condescending optimism. Radiation? What radiation? That's just capitalist propaganda. Probably the Americans with their films and microwaves. When Geiger counters at nearby facilities began maxing out, as in literally hitting the limit of what they could measure, the official response wasn't, evacuate the city. It was, our instruments must be broken. Or better yet, we'll send someone to check. That someone, by the way, usually didn't come back feeling particularly healthy. Meanwhile, over in Sweden, workers at a nuclear plant were getting abnormal radiation readings on their clothes, and they hadn't had any accidents. Within hours, they figured out that the wind was blowing in something nasty from the Soviet Union. You know things are bad when a completely different country figures out you've had a nuclear meltdown before your own population does. And yet, the Kremlin stayed quiet. Even the people inside the reactor compound, plant workers, engineers, guards, weren't fully informed. Some were told they were handling a minor incident. Others were issued iodine pills without being told why. For reference, if someone hands you mysterious pills and says, "Don't ask questions, just swallow," that's generally a red flag. A very radioactive red flag. Eventually, The higher-ups realized they couldn't hide this forever. That's when the evacuation order finally came. But even then, it was spun as a temporary measure. Citizens were told they'd be gone for 3 days. Just grab your documents, your lunch, and maybe a sweater. Leave the pets, leave the valuables. Don't worry about the smell of burning graphite in the air. Or the soldiers, with Geiger counters clicking like tap dancers on caffeine. The buses rolled in, thousands of people boarded, still in disbelief. There were no hazmat suits, no loudspeakers warning about radiation, just soldiers watching solemnly, and officials repeating the phrase, "Don't panic," like it was a lullaby. Meanwhile, the streets of Pripyat were already dangerously contaminated. People were walking through radioactive dust. Their shoes, clothes, and hair would carry it with them, into buses, into new cities, into history. And still, the Soviet press said nothing. It wasn't until 2 days later, when Sweden filed an official complaint to the International Atomic Energy Agency, that the USSR finally admitted something had happened. And even then, they downplayed it. An incident occurred. The situation is under control, which is like saying a shark just bit off your leg. But don't worry, it probably won't come back for the other one. So here's survival tip #3. If the authorities say everything is fine, run. Especially if they're wearing crisp uniforms and not blinking. If they smile too hard and insist there's nothing to worry about while you're vomiting neon. That's your cue to grab your bag and get very, very far away. Because when your government is more afraid of embarrassment than fallout, you're not just dealing with radiation, you're dealing with a disaster made worse by denial. And denial, it turns out, has a half-life even longer than uranium. Radiation. Invisible, silent, tasteless. It doesn't knock. It doesn't scream. It just walks through walls, slithers into your cells, and whispers to your DNA. Let's mess everything up. After the Chernobyl explosion, many of the first victims weren't crushed by debris or burned by fire. No. What got them was the slow, relentless punch of ionizing radiation. A kind of energy so powerful that it breaks molecular bonds like a toddler snapping spaghetti. And once it gets inside your body, things go downhill fast, but not immediately. And that's where the horror gets clever. Let's say, for example, that you're one of the firefighters at Reactor 4. You rush in, you're brave, you're heroic. You get blasted by a cloud of radioactive steam so potent it could cook a steak. You might expect to drop dead on the spot, right? Nope. Not how this nightmare works. Radiation poisoning is a bit of a trickster. At first you feel fine, maybe a little dizzy. Maybe your mouth tastes like copper. Maybe your skin tingles a bit. Like a sunburn that hasn't made up its mind yet. But within hours, sometimes minutes if your dose was high enough, you begin a descent into a very specific kind of hell known as acute radiation syndrome, ERS. Let's break this down in digestible, if somewhat horrifying, terms. Phase 1 is the prodromal stage, also known as the body saying nope. This usually starts with nausea, vomiting, fatigue and diarrhea, which doesn't sound so bad until you realize your body is trying to evict every system at once. It's like your insides decided to speedrun the flu, food poisoning, and a hangover, all at once. Then comes the truly sinister part, the latent phase. After all that misery, you start to feel better. No more vomiting. Energy returns. Skin might still be a bit red, but hey, you're upright. This is the cruel fake-out, the calm before the internal storm. Many early victims of Chernobyl were seen joking and chatting during this phase, unaware that their cells were being quietly liquefied on the microscopic level. Next comes the manifest illness phase, also known as the moment you realize you're not getting better. You're actively decomposing while alive. Skin begins to blister. Your immune system collapses. Hair falls out in clumps. Your bone marrow, the stuff responsible for making blood, shuts down. Internal bleeding starts. Organs give up. The body becomes a battlefield, and radiation is winning. As one nurse later described it, they weren't just sick, they were unraveling. Patients were often isolated, not to prevent contagion, but because their bodies were literally radioactive. Their clothing, sheets, even sweat could contaminate the room. Medical staff had to wear protective gear just to change bandages. Now, about that quote, it's like the worst sunburn of your life combined with the flu, but from the inside out. That's not an exaggeration, it's generous. Radiation burns don't just stay on the surface. They burrow inward. The heat from gamma rays cooks tissues from within. Your skin might look fine one day, and the next, it's sloughing off like old wallpaper. No fever, no blisters, just layers of your body deciding they'd rather not participate anymore. And the cruelest part, you can't see or smell the dose. There's no built-in Geiger counter in the human body. No instinctual warning that says, hey, you just absorbed 600 rads, maybe duck. Two people can stand side by side, and one might feel okay while the other's cells are going full popcorn mode. Why? Because radiation doesn't distribute itself evenly. It depends on exposure time, distance, shielding, and dumb luck. This is why some people didn't get sick right away, or at all. Many Pripyat citizens, even those exposed to radioactive fallout, didn't receive doses high enough to trigger ARS. Their risk was long-term cancer, organ damage, genetic mutations. But in the first days, they could breathe the air and still go grocery shopping. Meanwhile, firefighters just yards away were getting zapped by gamma rays strong enough to sterilize a cow in under a minute. This is what makes radiation the real killer. Not just its power, but its ambiguity. You don't know how much you've received until it's either way too late, or not at all. It's roulette with your own chromosomes. Sometimes you walk away, sometimes you become a medical case study, wrapped in a lead-lined blanket. And contrary to Hollywood logic, there are no superpowers. No glowing green fists or telepathy. Just vomiting, bleeding gums, and the creeping sense that your skin might be trying to quit the job of skin. So here's your next survival tip. Do not trust your feelings. If you're standing in the aftermath of a nuclear accident, and you feel okay, that might be the worst news possible. The okay phase is the trap. It means you got just enough radiation to destroy your internal systems without sending up immediate alarms. If your skin isn't on fire but the guy next to you is melting, get out. And if someone tells you the tingling in your fingers is just nerves, well, technically they're right. Those nerves are dying. Radiation doesn't scream, it whispers. And sometimes the whisper says, you've already lost. So you found yourself in a city, quietly marinating in radioactive fallout. Your Geiger counter is clicking like tap shoes on espresso. The good news? You're not dead. The bad news? Your odds of staying that way depend on how creative you can get with household items, Soviet equipment, and a deep denial of mortality. Let's talk about protection, or rather, the illusion of it. First up, iodine tablets. These were the miracle candy handed out to Pripyat residents after the invisible cloud of radiation had already waltzed through town. The logic? Radiation releases radioactive iodine 131, which your thyroid gland slurps up like it's on sale. But if you flood your body with non-radioactive iodine first, your thyroid gets too full to be fooled. Think of it like distracting a toddler with candy while you clean up their crayons from the wall incident. Except there's a catch. Iodine pills only work before exposure. Afterward, it's like putting on sunscreen the morning after your sunburn. Nevertheless, out they went. Entire schools were given the pills. No explanation. Just swallow this and don't ask questions. Classic Soviet health advice. Next, gas masks. A staple of every Soviet emergency manual. Rows upon rows were handed out to soldiers, workers, and anyone who looked vaguely like they might be useful. The iconic image of men in heavy rubber suits, large bug-eyed masks, and boots that looked better suited for fishing trips on Venus. That was the Soviet idea of hazmat chic. But were they effective? Kind of. Against dust and larger particles? Sure. Against gamma rays? Not so much. You could look like Darth Vader's anxious cousin and still absorb a fatal dose just by standing in the wrong place. Gamma radiation, after all, doesn't care about your fashion sense. Enter the lead apron. The nuclear era's version of medieval armor. Liquidators. Those tasked with cleaning up the radioactive mess often wore vests with thin lead plates sewn inside. Some even stood behind lead doors on wheels, using them as makeshift shields while sprinting across the reactor roof. It was like playing hide-and-seek with death, except death could pass through walls. And it wasn't just aprons. There were lead-lined trucks, lead-lined bulldozers, and rumors of people trying to tape lead cooking trays to their chests. If you're wrapping yourself in tinfoil, congrats. You're either preparing for radiation or aliens. Either way, your survival odds are roughly the same. Now, what about the everyday folk? No rubber suits, no Geiger counters, just ingenuity, and maybe a mildly protective trench coat. Some wrapped their windows in plastic, stuffed their doors with wet rags, and wore scarves across their faces, like it was a particularly judgmental dust storm. Mothers bathed their children obsessively, hoping to scrub the fallout away. They washed their hair with vinegar, their clothes with salt, and their vegetables with, well, desperation. One popular urban legend from the time, that drinking vodka could help fight radiation. Spoiler, it didn't. But the belief ran so deep that liquor stores were raided. Soldiers took shots before entering dangerous zones. Whether it helped the nerves or just made dying more fun, we'll never know. But if you were sober in Soviet Ukraine in 1986, you were in the minority and probably very nervous. And then there were the animals. When Pripyat was evacuated, people were told to leave everything behind, including their pets. Dogs, cats, birds, rabbits, all left to roam a city that now belonged to silence and dust. Many waited at the doors for their humans to return. Others wandered the streets, confused but loyal. The military was later ordered to enter the exclusion zone and euthanize all the animals, not because they were dangerous, but because they were contaminated, living, breathing vectors of radiation. It's one of the more quietly devastating chapters of the disaster. Soldiers chasing wagging tails through abandoned neighborhoods, rifles in hand, tasked with ensuring that no one's loyal companion would one day carry isotopes back into the human world. Some pets survived, some even formed feral packs. To this day, the Chernobyl dogs, descendants of those left behind, roam the zone. They are now monitored, occasionally fed, and studied by scientists. Radiation may have warped their genetics, but not their instincts. They still play, they still follow strangers, and some still wait by the gates. In the face of an invisible enemy, protection became equal parts science, improvisation, and tragic theatre. You had people in full hazmat suits next to shirtless labourers, shoveling graphite. You had iodine and vodka, gas masks and open windows, lead aprons and fabric shoe covers. So here's your survival tip. Real protection against radiation, distance, time, and shielding. That's it. If your defense strategy involves vodka, tablecloths, or a tin casserole pan duct taped to your chest, you're not surviving, you're decorating yourself for your own funeral. The irony of Chernobyl is that, in the absence of clear information, people clung to whatever they could. Science, rumor, intuition, a scarf over the mouth, a lead door on wheels, a pocket flask. None of it was enough, but they tried anyway, because when the air itself is the enemy, what else can you do? April 27th, 1986. The sun rose over Pripyat, calm and unbothered, as if the day wasn't already laced with invisible poison. For 36 hours, the residents of this ideal Soviet city had lived, breathed, and slept in the fallout zone of the worst nuclear disaster in history, completely unaware. And now, finally, the government was ready to act, but not with sirens, not with urgency. No, Pripyat's evacuation was announced via gentle loudspeaker, like a Sunday picnic invitation. Trucks rolled in, buses lined the streets, and a cool female voice echoed through the city. Comrades, due to an incident at the Chernobyl power station, a temporary evacuation is being conducted. Please pack essential belongings. You will return in 2 to 3 days. 2 to 3 days. Bring your essentials. Food, water, documents, and maybe that one pan you keep burning eggs in. Don't bring pets. Don't pack furniture. Leave windows shut. Lock the doors if you like. It's just a weekend trip after all. What do you pack when you're told your home will still be there tomorrow? A change of clothes? Your passport? Maybe the family photo album? But probably not. It's bulky, and you'll be back before dinner. Most people didn't even bring underwear. Why would you? You weren't fleeing war. You weren't escaping a fire. You were following orders, politely and obediently, like a good Soviet citizen should. And so, 50,000 people boarded buses with plastic bags and puzzled expressions. Children clutched dolls. Teenagers carried cassette players. Mothers wore kerchiefs and worry in equal measure. No hazmat suits. No gas masks. Just everyday people, caught in a moment that history hadn't yet labelled as catastrophic. The buses rolled out of Pripyat, in neat, orderly lines. Soldiers monitored the crowds. Doctors handed out iodine tablets, like breath mints. Some people waved to neighbours. Others left kettles still hot on the stove. They were told the air was safe. They were told the danger had passed. They were told, above all, not to panic. Behind them, the city they built, apartment blocks with floral curtains, schools with chalk still on the boards, hospitals still stocked with aspirin and optimism, began to fall silent. And then, it stayed silent. The promised few days turned into weeks. Weeks became months. Months into decades. No one ever returned home. Pripyat was sealed off like a time capsule, a perfectly preserved Soviet dream that just happened to glow a little too much in the dark. Walk through it today, and it feels like the opening scene of a post-apocalyptic movie, where you already know everyone is gone. The famous Ferris wheel, never used, never turned, still looms over the empty amusement park. Its cars are rusted, creaking, frozen in place like the smile of a forgotten clown. The carnival was supposed to open on May 1st. Instead, the only thing it welcomed was fallout. Inside the schools, notebooks still sit on desks, some open to math problems, paused mid-scribble. Children's coats still hang from pegs, ready for recess that never came. Gas masks litter the floors, not worn during the event, but brought in later by cleanup crews and left behind like surreal party favors. Apartments are frozen midlife. Dishes still sit in sinks. Shoes remain by the door. Some clocks still hang on the walls, stopped forever at the hour their owners left. Pripyat wasn't destroyed in the way cities usually are. It didn't burn. It wasn't bombed. It wasn't dismantled. It simply stopped. And perhaps that's the most haunting part. The absence isn't loud. It's quiet, polite, like a house left untouched after the guests have gone home, but no one comes to clean up. The dust settled where people once laughed. Mold grows on toys. Wallpaper peels like old memories. And the people, they were scattered. Some moved to nearby cities. Others were relocated to hastily built towns. They became footnotes, radiation refugees. The former residents of Pripyat. Some died of cancer. Some lived long, healthy lives, but never unpacked those plastic bags they carried on evacuation day. What was the point? Their homes were still there, technically, just behind a few layers of barbed wire, warning signs, and radioactive soil. In the years since, some survivors returned briefly on government-sanctioned trips. They walked through their old neighborhoods wearing protective suits, staring at the ghosts of themselves. One woman wept when she saw her old curtains still fluttering in the breeze, just as she had left them. And yes, the pan she always burned eggs in, still sitting on the stove. Survival tip for you. If the government tells you to evacuate for 3 days, take everything you love, because history has a twisted sense of humor, and sometimes temporary means forever. Pripyat wasn't just evacuated, it was abandoned mid-breath. A city put on pause and never resumed. A snapshot of 1986 Soviet life, complete with Cold War propaganda, bad architecture, and a nuclear aftertaste. And it's still there, growing weeds through its sidewalks, sheltering mutant trees, and quietly whispering to anyone who visits, "We were told we'd be back." When something goes catastrophically wrong in a society that thrives on secrecy and denial, someone eventually has to do something. Enter the liquidators. The men and women who were handed shovels, brooms, lead aprons, and orders vague enough to qualify as war crimes. Officially known as cleanup workers, liquidators were the Soviet Union's oh-so-casual term for the 600,000 plus people recruited to clean up after the worst nuclear disaster in human history. Their jobs ranged from bulldozing radioactive villages to wiping reactor dust off rooftops with rags. Not lead-enforced rags, just rags. Imagine saving the world with a shovel and being told you'll get a free bus ride home. That was the liquidator experience. They came from everywhere. Soldiers, miners, factory workers, scientists, firemen, farmers. Some volunteered, many didn't. Some were invited by the military, which is Soviet for "you're going," or else. Most of them weren't told the full truth, just that they were needed to contain a small incident. You know, the kind of small incident that melts reactor cores and poisons 3 countries. And what they walked into was less of a job, and more of a radioactive funhouse with no exits. Take the men assigned to clean the reactor roof, for instance, nicknamed the bio-robots. These were soldiers and workers who had to remove radioactive debris by hand, because actual robots kept breaking from the radiation. The radiation on the roof was so intense it could kill a man in under 2 minutes. Cook film inside sealed cameras and reduce electronics to expensive paperweights. The plan: each bio-robot got 90 seconds on the roof, no more. Just enough time to sprint out, scoop some graphite chunks with a shovel, and hurl them off the edge into the open core below. If you survived your 90 seconds, you were considered lucky. If you passed out mid-sprint, you got dragged back and replaced. If you asked questions, the answer was keep shoveling. Their gear, cloth suits, rubber gloves, and lead sheets strapped to their chests, like medieval breastplates. These weren't hazmat suits. These were, if it looks like armor, maybe it'll work, suits. Helmets, gas masks, and heavy boots completed the look. Picture 1980s cosplay meets post-apocalyptic landscaping. And then there were the miners, called in to dig a tunnel beneath Reactor 4 to install a cooling system that might prevent another explosion. They worked underground in suffocating heat. Temperatures reached 50 degrees Celsius, 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Many stripped naked just to function. No protective gear, no ventilation, just picks, shovels, and the looming fear that the ground might melt beneath them. If a tunnel could sweat, this one did. And still, they did it. They dug the tunnel. They completed it ahead of schedule. And the system they were building never needed in the end. But they didn't know that. They showed up and did the job like it mattered. Because it did. Liquidators cleared forests, buried vehicles, demolished homes, and sprayed contaminated buildings with glue-like chemicals to keep radioactive dust from blowing around like Soviet fairy dust. They worked in rotating shifts, many exposed to doses that would have shut down entire countries. They climbed trees to shoot down radioactive birds. They drained radioactive water from the plant's basements by hand. They rode modified tanks to push rubble into the crater of the reactor. Some even herded abandoned radioactive livestock into mass graves. Imagine being told, "Comrade, today's mission, goat wrangling with gamma rays." And through it all, there was a bizarre sense of normalcy enforced from the top. Propaganda posters cheered them on. Victory over the atom was a real slogan. Some were awarded medals, others got nothing but a sandwich, a lukewarm beer, and an early grave. Estimates suggest over 100,000 suffered serious health issues, cancers, blood disorders, neurological problems. Many died young. Others just disappeared from the records, like inconvenient numbers swept under a bureaucratic rug. Yet, despite everything, many of them remained proud of what they did, because make no mistake, these were the people who actually saved Europe. Without their efforts, the fallout could have contaminated half the continent. A second explosion could have rendered the area permanently uninhabitable. The core might have burned for months. It was their back-breaking, absurd and often suicidal work that stabilized the situation. Work done in 90-second shifts with a shovel and a prayer. So here's your survival tip for this chapter. If someone shows up wearing rubber boots, holding a metal bucket, and tells you they're here to stop a nuclear disaster, follow them. That's who's saving you. Not the generals in offices, not the officials in suits, the guy with graphite dust on his eyebrows and radioactive sweat in his boots. The liquidators weren't scientists. They weren't celebrities. They were regular people with names like Yuri, Ivan, and Sergei. They didn't ask to be heroes. But when the Soviet system cracked open and spilled its nuclear guts, they were the ones holding the mop, steady hands, bitter jokes and all, buried deep beneath the smouldering wreckage of Reactor No. 4. Past twisted pipes, irradiated steel, and enough concrete to rebuild your childhood trauma, lies one of the deadliest objects ever created by human accident. It has no beating heart. It doesn't hiss or hum or glow with sci-fi menace, but come too close, and it will kill you. It's called the elephant's foot. Now, if that name sounds oddly adorable, like something you'd find in a Dr. Seuss book, don't be fooled. This is not a gentle jungle stomp. This is a 2-ton blob of molten nuclear horror that looks like lava, kills like bureaucracy, and sits there silently, plotting your cellular demise. Let's back up. After reactor number 4 exploded, the uranium fuel rods, graphite moderator, control rods, and the very structure of the reactor melted. But not gently. This wasn't a candle in the sun kind of melt. This was a 2000 degrees Celsius nuclear exorcism that turned reinforced concrete into radioactive pudding. The mixture of sand, steel, zirconium, and core material fused together into a molten mass. It flowed downward like some hellish fondue until it hardened into a solid mass of corium, a substance so toxic that even the name sounds like it belongs in a villain's monologue. The most infamous of these masses settled beneath the reactor in a maintenance tunnel. It was big. It was ugly. It had hardened into something that looked like the wrinkled, cracked surface of an elephant's foot. Hence the name. If you were expecting science to give it a terrifying code like X235 Death Bull, too bad. We got the elephant's foot. Science has a sense of humor. A bleak one. Here's the nightmare when the elephant's foot was discovered in late 1986. Just months after the explosion, it was still extremely hot, both thermally and radioactively. At that time, spending just 30 seconds next to it meant certain death within days. Stand there for 5 minutes, and congratulations, your insides would be quietly digesting themselves by the end of the week. This was not hypothetical. Early attempts to photograph it were borderline suicidal. One brave technician, wearing a protective suit that may as well have been tissue paper, crept close with a camera rig on wheels. The camera lasted a few frames before the radiation fried the film and the electronics. Later, they tried again, this time using a mirror to reflect the image from around the corner. Yes, it was so dangerous that scientists invented the world's most terrifying periscope, and yet, it just sits there. The foot doesn't move, it doesn't steam anymore. It doesn't glow, despite every horror film's deepest wish, but it's still lethal. Its radiation levels have decreased. Yes, but it's still radioactive enough to ruin your blood count and give your skin some unique textures. Think crispy bacon, but internal. Now here's the kicker. We made this thing. By accident. This wasn't engineered in a lab or designed by Bond villains. It's the physical embodiment of what happens when you mix arrogance, poor communication, outdated safety systems, and a nuclear reactor running a terrible midnight science experiment. It's the remains of human hubris baked at hellfire temperatures, then left to cool like a vengeful monument. And ironically, it's now a scientific curiosity. Over the years, the foot has been studied extensively. Its radioactive signature has dropped. Enough that people can now spend brief moments near it without immediately liquefying. Researchers in the early 2000s managed to drill into it and retrieve samples. Yes, someone stood near it long enough to drill a hole. That job listing probably read, "Must be comfortable with power tools, tight spaces, and death." Today, the elephant's foot sits behind layers of concrete in the sarcophagus of Reactor No. 4. It isn't getting out, but that doesn't mean we've tamed it. It remains a reminder that radiation doesn't just linger. It seeps, stains, and settles in. And long after the politicians are gone, the foot will still be there, waiting, glowering, glowing. No, but glowering, definitely. Oh, and here's a delightful thought. Scientists estimate that the elephant's foot will remain lethally radioactive for over 100,000 years. That's longer than the entire history of agriculture, longer than the pyramids have existed, longer than your family's argument about who actually broke grandma's vase. So here's your survival tip for this chapter. If something looks like molten tree bark, is inside a failed nuclear reactor, and has a charming nickname, don't touch it. Don't take selfies with it. Don't poke it with a stick. Don't even look at it without squinting suspiciously. Because the elephant's foot is one of the only objects in the world that can kill you for being curious. It's not just a blob of nuclear waste. It's a monument to human overconfidence. Proof that when we mess up badly enough, we leave behind artifacts that future civilizations or cockroaches will study and say, "Ah yes, this is where they went wrong," and they'll be right. Could you actually survive? Short answer. No, but let's pretend. Let's not sugarcoat it. You would not survive Chernobyl. Not in any heroic, Hollywood, slow-motion walk-away from the blast kind of way. Not with iodine tablets in one hand and a Geiger counter in the other. Not even if you had the reflexes of a ninja and the immune system of a cockroach. Because survival, in this scenario, isn't about being strong, brave, or clever. It's about not being there in the first place. Seriously, your best chance of survival, be on vacation, in another country. Preferably one without glowing clouds on the weather forecast. But let's humour the idea. You, dear listener, somehow get dropped into Chernobyl's 1986 timeline. You've got no warning, no training, and a backpack full of poor decisions. Let's go through your hypothetical survival plan step by step, shall we? Step 1. Don't touch anything. If it looks weird, avoid it. If it doesn't look weird, also avoid it. Radioactivity doesn't come with a neon sign or a menacing hum. It looks like dust, gravel, air, That chunk of black rock on the ground, that's graphite from the reactor core. It's hotter than your social anxiety and twice as deadly. Rule of thumb. If it looks interesting, it's probably already killed someone. Step 2. Don't believe the government. When loudspeakers tell you to remain calm, don't. When officials in suits say everything's under control, start running. The Soviet government's idea of crisis management was denial on toast, served with a side of "why are you asking so many questions?" If someone hands you iodine pills with no explanation and a nervous smile, assume the worst. The radiation isn't theoretical. It's in the air, the water, the soup, and probably your socks. Step 3. Do not be brave. Heroism is a luxury for people not standing next to a nuclear meltdown. Those firefighters who ran in to battle the blaze, absolute legends. But you're not trained. You don't have protective gear. You have a smartphone and a vague sense of danger you picked up from watching Chernobyl on TV. If your instincts scream, do something. Your survival depends on answering, no thank you. Step 4. Avoid local milk. This sounds oddly specific, but trust us. One of the first things to get contaminated was the grass. The cows ate the grass. The milk came from the cows. The milk went into kids. The thyroids went kaboom. So if someone offers you a glass of warm local dairy as a sign of hospitality, say something like, "I'm lactose intolerant, also nuclear intolerant." Step 5. Time, distance, shielding. This is the holy trinity of radiation safety. The less time you're exposed, the better. The farther away, the better. And the more stuff between you and the source, preferably lead, concrete, or 12,000 metric tons of dirt, the better. Your homemade foil helmet isn't going to cut it, but a couple meters of Soviet bunker just might. Still, even with perfect behavior, you'd need superhuman luck. You'd need to be born with anti-radiation skin or a time machine, because Chernobyl wasn't just a local disaster. It was a systemic one, a perfect storm of human error, design flaws, secrecy, and delay. The reactor exploded. Yes, but it was the cover-ups, the hesitation, and the slow-motion reaction time that truly doomed the people. So what did humanity learn from this slow-moving catastrophe? Well, in some ways, a lot. Reactor design has improved. International cooperation on nuclear safety became less of a formality and more of a panicked necessity. Radiation monitoring stations popped up like mushrooms after rain. The phrase RBMK reactor now makes engineers wince, but in other ways, not enough. Governments still hide things. Corporations still cut corners. People still believe that if they can't see the problem, maybe it'll go away. And disasters, nuclear or otherwise, still remind us that progress doesn't mean perfection. Just because we can split the atom doesn't mean we should do it with 1970s wiring and a management team that thinks meltdown is a PR term. Chernobyl remains a radioactive scar on history, not because of what it was, but because of how it could have been prevented. The explosion was a result of hubris dressed in a lab coat, bureaucracy wearing a blindfold, and physics refusing to play along with Soviet optimism. The exclusion zone still exists today. It's become a bizarre eco-reserve, a haunting museum, and a selfie hotspot for people who apparently think radiation is great Instagram content. The wildlife is thriving, the buildings are decaying, and the elephant's foot is still sulking in its cement crypt. And through it all, the lesson echoes: when you build something powerful enough to light a city, make sure it's not also powerful enough to erase it. So could you survive the Chernobyl incident? No, but you might survive learning about it, and maybe that's the better outcome, because the real test isn't whether you'd live through a meltdown, it's whether you can understand one, respect the science, and remember what happens when we gamble with forces we barely control, especially when the reactor gets moody. At its height, the British Empire was less of a country and more of an aggressively polite land acquisition strategy. It didn't just stretch across continents, it wrapped them like cling film. They claimed land so enthusiastically. It's a miracle they didn't try to colonize the moon just to build a cricket pitch. Picture this. It's the late 19th century, and you're looking at a globe. It's mostly covered in British red. Canada, British. India, very British. Australia, filled with ex-British. Africa, a buffet of British colonies, carved up like a Sunday roast. The Caribbean, you guessed it, British, but sweatier. Even small, pointless rocks in the middle of nowhere flew the Union Jack, just in case someone else got ideas. The logic seemed to be, if we can stand on it, name it new something, and then write a letter home about how splendid it is, we'll take it. This wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate, well-oiled machine of conquest. At the heart of the whole imperial operation was a delightful cocktail of God, gold, glory, and tea. Emphasis on the tea. Let's start with God. Missionaries were dispatched across the globe to civilize the heathens, which was Victorian English for hand out Bibles and make people wear trousers. Converts were ideal, but what really mattered was planting the moral flag next to the actual flag. Gold came next, though more metaphorically. It was about wealth, spices, silk, cotton, sugar, rubber, opium, minerals, basically anything you could dig up, bottle, steal, or force someone else to grow for you. The British economy didn't just run on resources, it ran on other people's resources, extracted with all the subtlety of a raccoon in a jewelry store. Glory was for the upper classes, of course. Colonizing was something aristocrats' second sons did when they realized they weren't inheriting the family castle. Father, I'm off to rule a small island I've never heard of and can't pronounce. Wish me luck. And then there was tea, the true foundation of the empire. Forget political theory. The British Empire was held together by caffeine and porcelain. The demand for tea fueled entire industries, wars, and more than one awkward dinner conversation with the Chinese emperor. Now, how did they get this sprawling landmass of global monopoly properties? Boats. Lots of boats. The British Navy wasn't just good. It was absurdly good. They didn't build ships. They built floating fortresses with enough cannons to ruin your weekend. And they sailed them everywhere. If the wind could take them, so could the empire. But they didn't stop at sailing. The Brits had an almost obsessive relationship with maps, the kind of people who would colonize a jungle just to sketch it. Cartography became Imperial Pokemon. Gotta chart 'em all. Every blank patch on the map wasn't a mystery. It was a challenge. Unexplored territory meant not British yet. Of course, this came with an attitude. The British viewed themselves as the peak of civilization. Never mind their fondness for unseasoned food and cholera outbreaks. If you weren't British, you were quaint, savage, or in need of proper governance. And if you were British, but not from London, congratulations. You were still inferior, but at least you had the right accent. And the language, oh the language. The British exported English like it was a gift. Never mind the fact that it came with silent letters, 17 meanings for the word set, and a grammatical structure that makes people cry. But to the British, it was part of the gift of civilization, along with railroads, afternoon tea, and sarcasm. Let's not forget the sheer scale of things. At its peak, the British Empire ruled over a quarter of the Earth's population and about 24% of its landmass. That's not a country, that's a multiplayer campaign. From Hong Kong to Gibraltar, Nairobi to Newfoundland, if there was a corner of the map where someone could say, "God save the Queen" without irony, it was probably British. And yet, despite this monumental reach, the empire was somehow obsessed with rules. There were rules for governance, dress, etiquette, and especially tea. Even at the outer edges of the empire, surrounded by unfamiliar languages, exotic animals, and very annoyed locals, a British officer would pause, pull out a lace doily, and sip his tea like he was in a London drawing room. Because standards must be maintained, even while conquering half the globe. Of course, managing such a monstrosity required an army of bureaucrats, diplomats, soldiers, and deeply confused map readers, but we'll get to their daily misery later. For now, just remember this. The British Empire was basically a hoarder with ships. If it wasn't nailed down, it got annexed. And if it was nailed down, they'd probably tax it, name it after Queen Victoria, and build a tea shop next to it. There are bad ideas, and then there's marching into a tropical jungle, wearing several pounds of wool, brass buttons, and moral superiority. Welcome to the military dress code of the British Empire, where discomfort was not only expected, it was mandatory. Let's start with the legendary red coat, also known as target practice in jacket form. This bright scarlet military uniform became iconic during Britain's 18th and 19th century expansions. It was supposed to signal power, unity, and discipline. What it actually signaled was, "Hi there, we're right here, and very easy to shoot at." Now imagine that same red wool jacket, heavy, scratchy, heat-absorbing, being worn in India, or Kenya, or anywhere on the equator, really. These were places where the humidity could steam a potato, and yet British troops were tramping around in full dress uniform, sweltering like roast beef at a Sunday pub. Why the red coat? One theory is that red dye was cheap, another is that bloodstains didn't show as clearly, which frankly tells you everything about British priorities at the time. Ah yes, Jenkins is bleeding out from a spear wound, but at least he matches the drapes. The uniforms weren't just impractical, they were symbolic. Clothing was a costume of control. The British believed their attire wasn't just about looking sharp, it projected civilization. If your entire body was screaming from heat exhaustion, but your cravat was properly tied, you were winning the war on savagery. And oh, the layers. Even the most minor colonial official would be decked out in waistcoats, high collars, long sleeves, and neatly polished boots, regardless of the weather, the terrain, or the likelihood of spontaneous combustion. A simple walk to the governor's office could become an endurance sport. Ladies weren't spared either. British women in the colonies arrived with trunks full of fashion, corsets, petticoats, parasols, and bonnets big enough to shade a horse. All this, in places where the local climate was actively trying to kill you. There's something poetic about someone fainting from heat stroke in a frilly dress, while trying to teach manners to the locals. And then there were the wigs. Yes, powdered wigs. Those fluffy symbols of Enlightenment-era sophistication occasionally made the voyage overseas. Nothing says, I'm in charge, quite like wearing a small flammable sheep on your head in 100-degree weather. They were eventually phased out. Sweat does not pair well with powder, but not before plenty of colonists sacrificed their hairlines, dignity, and hydration levels to the cause of looking regal. You'd think, perhaps, that someone in the Empire might look around and say, you know what, maybe we should dress like the people who live here. People who clearly understand how to survive the heat without fainting. But no, that would mean blending in, and the entire purpose of colonial dress was to stand out. Clothes were a flag you wore, and if the locals thought you looked absurd, that just confirmed how advanced you were. Even the informal clothing, for off-duty officers or dinner parties, came with ridiculous standards. Linen suits still had to be starched to within an inch of their lives. Hats were mandatory, shoes polished to military shine, and every button must be buttoned, no exceptions. A loose collar was practically treason. This devotion to inappropriate fashion had consequences. British troops fainted in ranks. Colonial officials suffered heat stroke during ceremonies. Entire banquets were cut short because someone's mustache started melting into the soup. And still, they soldiered on, because what was heat stroke compared to the horror of looking informal? The irony? In private, many British colonials did adopt local clothing, light cottons, sandals, even turbans, but this was always behind closed doors, away from judging eyes. In public, it was back into the oven they went, because to appear too comfortable, too native, was considered weak, or worse, un-British. And let's not forget the ceremonial uniforms, which took things from miserable to absurd. Officers wore gold braids, plumed helmets, and swords they'd never use, marching through monsoons like overdressed parade floats. Some of them were so heavily ornamented, they couldn't sit down without assistance. But they looked like empire, and that's what mattered. So if you're imagining yourself in colonial Britain, striding confidently through the savannah, inspecting a regiment, or hosting a tea party under the blazing sun, just know you'd be doing it while wearing 4 layers of fabric, refusing to sweat in front of subordinates, pretending the bugs crawling in your collar are part of the local charm, because, as every British colonial knew, nothing screams I belong here, like melting in your wool blazer, while pretending malaria is a minor inconvenience. If the British Empire had a love language, it wasn't words of affirmation, it was taxes, and tea, and taxing tea. To understand the true engine of colonial Britain, you don't need a map, you need a shopping list. The empire wasn't just about land, it was about stuff. Glorious, delicious, smuggled, overpriced stuff. Sugar from the Caribbean, spices from India, textiles from everywhere, and above all, tea, the magical leaf water that built a navy, funded a bureaucracy, and nearly caused an American nervous breakdown. Let's start with the obvious. The British were obsessed with tea. Not enjoy a cup in the morning. Obsessed. No, this was fuel our entire colonial economy. to maintain a national caffeine habit. Obsessed. By the 18th century, tea had gone from an exotic luxury to a national necessity. It wasn't just a drink, it was a lifestyle, a ritual, a coping mechanism for living under grey skies and imperial paperwork. Unfortunately, tea didn't grow in Surrey, it had to be imported, primarily from China at first, where the British had little to offer in exchange, except silver. Lots of silver. That got expensive fast. So they did what any good empire does, found a loophole and ruined everything. Enter the East India Company, that charmingly evil hybrid of hedge fund, megastore, and private army. This wasn't just a company. It was a geopolitical monster that could declare war, sign treaties, and jack up prices on tea until a colonist wig curled. To balance their tea addiction without going broke, the British came up with a genius plan: sell opium to China, then use the profits to buy more tea. Yes, that's right. The solution to their caffeine problem was to start a drug problem elsewhere, and thus the infamous triangular trade loop formed. India produced the opium. China got addicted to it. Britain used the resulting silver to buy tea. The colonies paid top dollar for that tea, plus import taxes, tariffs, and a nice side order of condescension. Which brings us to taxes. Now, the British have always had a complicated relationship with taxation. They love it, as long as it's happening to someone else, and that someone else was often their colonies, especially the American ones, who, as it turned out, weren't particularly thrilled about being used as the empire's piggy bank. So Britain began taxing everything they could think of: stamps, newspapers, molasses, glass, paint, lid, dice. If it existed, it got taxed, and if it didn't exist, well, British tax policy: if it exists, we'll tax it. If it doesn't, we'll invent it, and then tax it. The Crown's logic was simple. The colonies benefited from British protection, occasional military chaos, so naturally, they should help pay for the empire's ever-expanding shopping list. But the colonists, not so keen. The real spark came with the Tea Act of 1773. On the surface, it lowered the price of tea by letting the East India Company sell directly to American colonies, cutting out middlemen. But here's the kicker: it still included a tax, and more importantly, it made it crystal clear that Britain believed it could tax its colonies without giving them representation in Parliament. And that, dear reader, was the final tea bag in the pot. Enter the Boston Tea Party, the colonial version of "we're not mad, we're just going to throw your entire cargo into the sea," while dressed as someone else. On December 16th, 1773, a group of American colonists, in an early example of both protest theatre and petty revenge, dressed up as Mohawk warriors, boarded 3 ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. That's roughly 90,000 pounds of tea, sacrificed to the gods of taxation rage. The British, naturally, did not take this well. They responded with the cursive acts. The colonies called them the intolerable acts, which were exactly what they sound like: punishments disguised as law. Things got even worse. Then muskets got involved. Then someone yelled, "Revolution," and the rest is very loud history. But here's the ironic part: tea sales in Britain actually soared, because nothing fuels a marketing campaign like dumping a fortune into a harbour. Boston hates this product. Must be worth drinking. Meanwhile, the empire learned a painful lesson. Taxing people without asking them first tends to end in property damage and eventual declarations of independence. A lesson, mind you, they would not fully absorb, as future chapters across the empire would demonstrate. But it wasn't just America. Other colonies, from Ireland to the Caribbean, got similar treatment. Britain taxed exports, imports, land, salt, even windows. That's right, in 1696, a window tax was introduced, so people literally bricked up their windows to avoid paying. Nothing says enlightenment like choosing darkness to save a few shillings. All of this fed into a larger truth. The British Empire didn't run on ideology alone. It ran on mercantilism, which is a fancy way of saying, we'll get rich, you'll get ruled, and we'll all pretend this is for your benefit. So next time you sip a warm cup of Earl Grey, remember, that tiny leaf once caused revolutions, bankruptcies, smuggling empires, and several ship captains to cry as their cargo was turned into soup. Everyone loves a good imperial epic. Ships, battles, heroic last stands in sun-bleached outposts. But here's the unsexy truth of colonial Britain. The empire didn't run on cannonballs and cavalry charges, it ran on paperwork, glorious, unnecessary, soul-draining paperwork. If the British Empire was a machine, its gears were turned not by soldiers, but by an underappreciated legion of clerks, record keepers, inspectors, auditors, and assistant undersecretaries to the deputy colonial attaché of stationery. These weren't explorers. They were men who crossed oceans to ensure supply forms were signed in ink and filed alphabetically. Adventurers in the art of administration. Let's be clear, conquering the world was only half the job. Once the Union Jack was hoisted and a portrait of Queen Victoria nailed to a mango tree, the real battle began, keeping track of everything. And oh, did the British keep track. There were ledgers, binders, parchments, and memos, some of which have survived longer than the colonies themselves. The British could write a 20-page report on a one-hut village's annual yam production, and somehow still forget to learn the local language. But the spreadsheet, spotless. Every colony, no matter how small or remote, had its very own colonial office, its own network of subordinate departments, and its own towering mountain of incoming and outgoing reports. You couldn't sneeze in Sierra Leone without someone in London receiving an official notification, logged in duplicate, and countersigned by someone who had never left Yorkshire. And oh, the titles. British administrators didn't just hand out jobs, they handed out job titles long enough to qualify as short novels. Acting Interim Deputy Commissioner for Agricultural Oversight, 3rd District was an actual thing. There were whole chains of command dedicated to issues like stamp duty, or toll gate tariffs, or the standards for road sign spacing in Upper Rhodesia. Entire careers were built upon the proper placement of commas in trade reports, the jewel in the bureaucratic crown, the dispatch, the imperial equivalent of an email, only longer, slower, and sealed with more wax. Rebellions, droughts, tribal unrest, or a shipment of spoiled marmalade. It didn't matter. All of it was conveyed via formal letters, laced with so much passive aggression, they practically dripped ink and disapproval. Your Excellency, I must regretfully inform you that the situation in the northern province has again deteriorated, possibly due to your unfortunate delay in forwarding Form 27B, provisions and perishables, seasonal. Yes, colonial governors often managed uprisings the way accountants handle overdue invoices, with stern memos and a faint hope that someone else will deal with it. These administrators lived lives of astonishing monotony. One might spend 20 years tracking timber shipments in Burma without ever once seeing a tree. Others managed road tolls in Ghana, wrote monthly reports on native temperament, or were put in charge of surveying rivers that routinely moved out of spite. And heaven help you if you misplaced a form. Losing a piece of colonial paperwork was akin to treason. Entire weeks were spent rewriting inventories, verifying exports, and conducting full-scale audits on items like 6 1/2 sacks of barley mildly damp. It was said that a properly maintained filing cabinet in a British colonial outpost could survive rebellion, war, and tropical mould. The empire might fall, but the registry office would remain. To the British mind, order was civilization, and nothing screamed order like stamping things. Rubber stamps were the sacred instruments of empire. There was a stamp for approvals, denials, receipts, rejections, exemptions, fines, and disciplinary memos. Even the stamps had backup stamps. To be a colonial administrator was not to lead, but to authorize. And then there were the surveys. Britain loved a good census. Every 10 years, no matter where you were, someone would try to count you, categorize you, and ask extremely nosy questions about your livestock. These surveys weren't always accurate, or even useful, but by God they were formatted properly. It was this obsession with structure that created some of the most enduring absurdities of the imperial system, like the time British officials in Sudan issued permits for camel licenses with annual renewal fees, of course, or when bureaucrats in India tried to measure rainfall with spoons because they didn't have calibrated gauges. But the form was filled out correctly, and that's what mattered. British colonial rule was 30% conquest and 70% paperwork in triplicate. This slow grind of imperial administration created an illusion of control. Never mind that local populations were rioting, crops were failing, and the roads were disintegrating. As long as the quarterly report was submitted on time and in the correct font, all was well in the empire. So if you're imagining your life in colonial Britain, Don't dream of swords and steamships. Picture instead a small wooden desk, an inkwell, a ledger the size of a toddler, and an endless line of petitions about goats. Because for every general who conquered a province, there were 10 pencil-pushing administrators who made sure the conquest was properly indexed, stamped, and filed under P for peculiar, but profitable. When the British Empire marched into a new land with flags, Bibles, and an alarming number of monocles, it wasn't always about spices, trade, or conquest. No, sometimes it was about something even more dangerous: good intentions. Welcome to the age of the civilizing mission, a peculiar cocktail of Victorian morality, colonial arrogance, and painfully unearned self-confidence. The idea was simple. The British didn't just believe they could run the world, they believed they should for the world's own good. Because nothing says global generosity like turning up uninvited and rearranging someone else's civilization, like you're redecorating a neighbor's house while they're still in it. The intellectual engine of this movement was the infamous concept of the white man's burden. Coined in the late 19th century, but informally practiced much earlier, it was the idea that white Europeans, especially the British, had a moral obligation to uplift non-European societies. And by uplift, we mean erase and replace everything from religion and language to fashion and fork usage. It went like this. You're welcome. We've arrived to improve your life by banning your customs, renaming your towns, and forcing you to wear wool trousers in 40 degrees Celsius heat. Don't mention it. This wasn't just policy, it was identity. To the average Victorian official, British culture wasn't one of many. It was the default setting for humanity. If you didn't speak English, drink tea, believe in Anglican sermons, or play cricket, you were in desperate need of reform. British customs weren't just better, they were considered divinely ordained, and any deviation was suspicious, exotic, or punishable by conversion. And so came the missionaries, one of the empire's most enthusiastic export models. While the army brought muskets and the clerks brought clipboards, the missionaries brought morality, along with hymn books, school chalk, and enough pamphlets to deforest a continent. Their mission to save souls, their method gently but persistently bulldoze your entire spiritual framework. Whether it was rural Nigeria or coastal India, missionaries would arrive in a flurry of lace-up boots and pious zeal, ready to explain why your gods were incorrect, and your holidays were now cancelled. They built schools, churches, and sometimes hospitals, but always with strings attached. You could learn to read, but only the Bible. You could get medicine, but not your ancestral remedies. And if you got baptized, you got bonus points. This was colonialism, with a halo. And it wasn't just religious, it was cultural. Locals were taught not just to pray like Brits, but to become little Brits in everything, from table manners to walking posture. Britishness was the export, and the colonies were the showroom floor. Of course, this all came with a dazzling dose of hypocrisy. While preaching morality, Britain was running opium trades in China, exploiting child labour at home, and occasionally launching wars over tea prices. But abroad, they were the moral police, scolding colonized societies for polygamy, idolatry, and dancing too enthusiastically. This improvement campaign often resulted in chaos, not clarity. Traditional leadership structures were undermined. Sacred sites were repurposed as government offices. Entire generations were taught to reject their heritage in favour of Shakespeare and Victoria's speech patterns. It was the cultural equivalent of giving someone a makeover and then burning their closet. Resistance came, naturally. Sometimes through rebellion, sometimes through satire, sometimes through quiet defiance. Locals adapted British customs on their own terms, reciting Bible verses in their mother tongue, wearing British-style clothes with indigenous fabrics, or founding Christian churches that bore little resemblance to anything in Westminster Abbey. In other words, the colonized didn't just surrender their identity, they reshaped Britishness itself, with a touch of irony and a lot of patience. The empire called it assimilation. Historians now call it cultural imperialism. Colonization wasn't just about territory, it was about turning people into mirrors of the empire's own inflated ego. And if those people happened to be already doing just fine without Queen Victoria's moral guidance, well, that was just inconvenient. Take language, for example. Entire generations were told their native tongues were inferior. In schools, children were beaten for speaking their own languages. The goal wasn't bilingualism, it was erasure. But ironically, in trying to destroy those languages, the British preserved them in thousands of school reports, missionary diaries, and confused grammar books written by people who barely understood what they were translating. This same dynamic played out with dress, food, architecture, and even timekeeping. In some colonies, local calendars were scrapped for the Gregorian version. Indigenous holidays were replaced with Empire Day, where you could celebrate being ruled by people who thought spices are for the weak. All of this raises the question, who exactly asked for this civilizing campaign? Spoiler, no one. But that didn't stop the British from proudly insisting they had improved everything, often while standing in the smouldering remains of temples, oral traditions, and social systems older than the Magna Carta. Nothing says helping like showing up uninvited and burning down someone's culture. So next time you hear about the British Empire bringing civilization, remember, sometimes it came with medicine and textbooks, but it also came with erasure, arrogance, and a suspicious fondness for rewriting everyone else's history, in ink of course, and only in English. For all the talk of British order, civilization and afternoon tea, one thing the empire really struggled with was this. People don't like being colonized. They might tolerate it for a while, especially if you come bearing guns, flags, and a 400-page rulebook. But sooner or later, someone's going to look at their taxed crops, erased culture, and strangely dressed overseers and say, actually no, this seems rubbish. Resistance was not an afterthought in the British Empire. It was the rhythm underneath the marching boots. From Ireland to India, Jamaica to Zululand, colonial subjects rose up again and again, loudly declaring that imperial rule was less of a gift and more of a long, unwelcome houseguest who drank all your tea and set fire to your shed. Let's begin with a particularly loud "No thank you," the Indian Rebellion of 1857, also known, depending on your perspective, as the Sepoy Mutiny, the First War of Independence, or the Big British Wake-Up Call. It started with the Sepoys, Indian soldiers employed by the British East India Company. These men were the backbone of the company's private army, trained, uniformed, and expected to follow orders. But by the mid-19th century, resentment was simmering. There were pay disputes, lack of promotion, blatant racism, and deep religious tensions. The final spark, a rifle cartridge, rumoured to be greased with cow and pig fat. For Hindu and Muslim soldiers alike, this was like asking them to eat a bacon cheeseburger at a temple, blasphemy in bullet form. The result? Widespread mutiny. British officers were killed, Indian rulers declared independence, and for several terrifying months, the empire trembled. Delhi was taken. So was Kanpur. The British eventually reasserted control through brutal military campaigns and equally brutal punishments. But the damage was done. The East India Company was dissolved, and the British Crown officially took over, not to be less imperial but to be more efficiently imperial. And then there was Zulu resistance. In 1879, the British Empire tried to annex Zululand in southern Africa, assuming that shiny helmets and polished boots would be enough to cow the locals. Enter King Cetshwayo and a whole lot of very annoyed Zulu warriors. The most famous clash, the Battle of Isandlwana, was a nightmare for British commanders. Zulu forces, equipped with traditional spears and a lot of determination, overwhelmed a British camp and killed over 1,300 Imperial troops in a single day. It was the kind of shock that forced London to momentarily put down its teacup and go, wait, they won. Of course, the Empire retaliated with overwhelming force and eventually defeated the Zulu, but not before realizing that you can't paperwork your way out of a stabbing. Resistance wasn't always military. In Ireland, rebellion came in many forms, from guerrilla warfare to satirical poetry, land reform movements and hunger strikes. British rule in Ireland, marked by centuries of exploitation, forced famines, and religious discrimination, created a constant simmer of defiance. The Easter Rising of 1916 was one of the most iconic moments, a small rebellion, brutally crushed, but one that sparked a national movement and eventually led to Irish independence in the 1920s. Meanwhile, across the Caribbean, enslaved people and their descendants resisted imperial control for generations. The Baptist War in Jamaica, 1831-32, led by the Baptist preacher Samuel Sharp, was one of the largest slave uprisings in the British West Indies. It was sparked not just by the conditions of slavery, but by the cruel twist that enslaved Jamaicans had heard rumours Britain was going to free them, and their masters were refusing. The revolt was put down with horrifying violence, but within a year, the British government, shocked by the uprising's scale, began moving toward full emancipation. Nothing says, maybe this system's a bit evil, like thousands of enslaved people rising up and torching sugar plantations. The fascinating part? The empire and the colonized never agreed on what was actually happening. Where the British saw treason, locals saw liberation. Where the British called it a mutiny, rebels called it freedom. Where one side claimed to be bringing order, the other side saw exploitation wrapped in legalese, and it wasn't always violent. Resistance came in the form of refusing to cooperate, speaking banned languages, writing anti-colonial newspapers, or simply continuing to exist as themselves in defiance of British norms. Culture became a weapon. Songs, stories, and dances became subversive acts. An entire generation of writers and activists used the very English the British had forced on them, and turned it back like a mirror. From Mahatma Gandhi's salt marches to Marcus Garvey's speeches in Jamaica, resistance evolved, grew smarter, and became global, and it often succeeded. Slowly, painfully, but undeniably. The British Empire was never toppled by a single war. It was eroded by 1,000 refusals to sit still and say thank you, because empires can take land, wealth, and names, but eventually they run into a problem even bureaucracy can't solve. People have opinions, and sometimes those opinions come with swords. So you've been posted to the far edge of the British Empire. Maybe you're in Ceylon, or Sierra Leone, or some corner of Malaya so humid it's practically soup. Congratulations, you are now an official representative of civilization, and you're expected to live like it, even if the jungle is actively trying to digest you. Being a British colonizer abroad was less about adapting to local life, and more about replicating Cheltenham in the Congo, brick by brick, doily by doily. You might be surrounded by tropical plants the size of small horses, but by God, you'd still host a garden party and insist the roses bloomed on time. Let's start with the first rule of colonial life. Never let the climate win. The British colonizer treated 110 degrees Fahrenheit heat like an embarrassing social gaffe, best ignored with a rigid posture and a tightly cinched collar. Sweating was considered undignified, despite being the body's literal scream for help. Officers still wore starched linen, ladies still wore corsets, and everyone still paused for tea at precisely 4 p.m. Even if the thermometer was melting and the biscuits had liquefied into a gentle paste. Even in the jungle, you must stop for tea at 4, malaria be damned. This wasn't just stubbornness, it was cultural armor. Routine was sacred, especially in the chaos of a foreign environment. That's why colonizers clung to their rituals with the intensity of a cat on a windowsill during a thunderstorm. Cricket pitches were erected in deserts, roast dinners were prepared in places where ovens were theoretical, and English lawns, delicate, thirsty, utterly unsuited to the tropics, were imported, complete with seeds, lawnmowers, and the delusion that grass would obey colonial law. And then there was gin and tonic, not just a drink, but a survival mechanism. Tonic water contained quinine, an anti-malarial compound. Gin contained denial. Together, they became the unofficial beverage of the empire. Many an official ended their day reclining in a rattan chair, drenched in sweat, swatting away insects the size of terriers, and muttering, "Another jolly fine day in paradise," while their spleen begged for mercy. Colonial homes were miniature time capsules. Mahogany furniture shipped thousands of miles, lace tablecloths, family portraits, a dusty piano that hadn't been tuned since Queen Victoria was alive. In India, it wasn't uncommon for officials to eat boiled beef in summer heat, so intense the wallpaper sweated off the walls, all to feel at home. Local cuisine was considered suspicious, unless filtered through at least 3 British recipes and boiled for good measure. And what of colonial wives? The unsung heroines of the empire, expected to run the household, bake scones, enforce British etiquette, and endure months of heat-induced hallucinations, all while maintaining the illusion that their garden club really did matter. Letters home were full of cheerful delusion. The natives are frightfully unreliable, but I've managed a marvellous plum pudding. Child rearing abroad was its own ordeal. British parents often sent their children back to England for schooling, because nothing says nurturing like abandoning your offspring to a damp boarding school 5,000 miles away. Those who stayed were dressed in tiny pith helmets and trained to wave politely at passing servants. Childhood was a mix of dysentery, discipline, and the vague suspicion that their nanny might be more competent than their father. Still, the colonizers weren't entirely heartless. Many were simply bewildered, plucked from Yorkshire and plonked into a completely different world with the instruction to go govern it. Most had no training, no language skills, and only the vaguest understanding of where they were. Their solution? Pretend harder. Pretend the heat wasn't intolerable. Pretend the locals didn't find them ridiculous. Pretend they were bringing order, even if the local goats had better infrastructure plans. Miscommunications were frequent and usually hilarious. One British official in Africa allegedly tried to outlaw a local dance because he thought it was a political protest. It was actually a wedding. Another tried to introduce fox hunting in a region that had never seen a fox. The locals offered him a goat instead, and things got weird fast. Despite the pomp and posturing, colonizers often lived in fear of disease, rebellion, scandal, or worst of all, being socially snubbed by the colonial club. Status was everything. An invitation to the governor's ball could elevate your reputation. Being caught drinking brandy before sundown could destroy it, and heaven forbid you be seen eating curry with your hands. That sort of thing ended careers. In time, many colonizers developed a sort of reluctant affection for their foreign postings, filtered through rose-tinted gin goggles. They'd return to England years later, complaining about the cold and the lack of decent mangoes. But while abroad, the message remained clear. Maintain dignity, maintain structure, and for heaven's sake, keep the bunting ironed, because even if the jungle was alive, the sun was an active threat, and the locals deeply unimpressed. The empire had its standards. You can take the Brit out of Surrey, but not the Surrey out of the Brit, even if he's surrounded by cobras and trying to explain croquet to a confused chieftain. So far we've seen the British Empire through the eyes of tea-sipping bureaucrats, gin-soaked colonizers, and red wool-wrapped optimists. But what was life like for the other 90% of the empire? You know, the people who lived there first. Well, imagine someone shows up to your house, declares it theirs, installs a butler you didn't ask for, takes your kitchen, your dog, and your paycheck, and then lectures you on how lucky you are to be modernized. That's colonial life, in a nutshell. From India to Kenya to Jamaica, the reality for the colonized was not garden parties and cricket matches. It was forced labor, economic extraction, humiliation, and the kind of racism that would make a Victorian monocle pop clean off. Let's start with the economics, because for all the talk of spreading civilization, the British Empire had a simpler goal: extract wealth, and do it with maximum efficiency and minimum concern for who got trampled. This is where the railroads come in. You'll often hear defenders of empire say things like, "But they built railroads." Sure, but they built them to get your stuff out faster. Those train tracks weren't zigzagging lovingly through towns to bring schools and joy. They were beelining from mines to ports, from tea fields to ships, from your labour to London's profit margins. British development plan: build a railroad, straight to the port where your stuff gets stolen. One of the most brutal examples, the Bengal famine of 1943. In the middle of World War II, while Britain was fighting for freedom in Europe, around 3 million Indians died of starvation, in large part because British policies had redirected food supplies to troops abroad, hoarded grain, and discouraged price controls to preserve the illusion of a functioning market. Meanwhile, Winston Churchill allegedly blamed the famine on the Indians, breeding like rabbits, because nothing says responsible governance like blaming the starving for being too alive. That wasn't an isolated incident. Famines under British rule were common. The 1876-78 famine killed another 5 million in India. Often there was food available, it just wasn't accessible. Crops were exported, relief was denied, and if you couldn't pay your land taxes because your rice field was now a poppy plantation for opium exports, tough luck. And while we're talking agriculture, British colonizers didn't just take land. They reorganized entire economies around imperial needs. In Africa, land was seized and designated for cash crops like cotton, cocoa, and coffee, all bound for European markets. This meant local food systems were gutted, traditional farming disrupted, and entire communities left dependent on volatile colonial trade networks they had zero control over. Next up, labor, forced labor. In many colonies, Working for the empire wasn't a choice. Indigenous people were rounded up for infrastructure projects, mines, plantations, and road building under systems of indenture, which is empire speak for you're not technically a slave, but you can't leave either. In Kenya, men were detained and conscripted into labor camps. In the Congo under Belgian rule, but let's not pretend the British were far off. People had their hands chopped off for not meeting rubber quotas, even in less overtly violent settings. Economic coercion did the trick. Want to pay your colonial tax? Better work on that British plantation. Want to avoid arrest? Join the labour scheme. Want to stay in your home? Sign over the rights to your land. This was not development. This was extraction with a flag. Social life under colonialism was no better. British policy created rigid racial hierarchies, usually with white administrators at the top, brown or black intermediaries in the middle, and indigenous populations at the bottom. Stripped of rights, dignity, and even identity, whole societies were told they were inferior, not just in politics or wealth, but in blood, culture, and character. Scientific racism became a justification for every injustice. Textbooks told you your civilization was backward. Newspapers printed caricatures of your leaders. Your name was anglicized. Your language banned in schools. Your customs outlawed or repackaged as exotic sideshows for colonial tourists. In settler colonies like Australia and Canada, indigenous people faced outright cultural genocide. Children were stolen from families and placed in residential schools designed to remove the Indian from the child. Languages vanished. Traditions were broken. Generations were scarred. Even religion wasn't safe. Missionaries didn't just preach. They often partnered with colonial governments to enforce assimilation. Traditional belief systems were declared savage. Temples and shrines were shut down. Festivals were banned or sanitized. And converts were rewarded with jobs, education, and less harassment, provided they renounced everything they used to be. And perhaps the most infuriating part, after decades or centuries of this treatment, when colonized people began to organize, to push back, to demand rights or even, gasp, independence, they were met with brutal crackdowns. Protests were shot down, movements were infiltrated, leaders were imprisoned or disappeared. The colonized were called rebellious, ungrateful, or uncivilized, for objecting to a system that had stolen their land, exploited their labor, erased their cultures, and then demanded they smile and wave at parades. British schoolchildren might have grown up reading Kipling's tales of brave explorers in exotic lands, but the children in those exotic lands were growing up malnourished, disenfranchised, and told that being conquered was for their own good. So yes, the British Empire brought railroads, schools, and some very efficient post offices, but it also brought starvation, systemic racism, forced labor, and a blueprint for exploitation that many nations are still trying to undo. Colonialism wasn't a handshake, it was a stranglehold, disguised with good penmanship and terrible boiled food. If the British Empire was once described as the empire on which the sun never set, by the mid-20th century, someone was clearly reaching for the light switch. After centuries of expansion, conquest, and paperwork, the mighty empire began to unravel, and not with dignity, but with confusion, bloodshed, and the unmistakable sound of a Union Jack being yanked off a flagpole for the 75th time that week. The decline didn't happen overnight. It was more like a very slow, very awkward goodbye, a sort of global, it's not you, it's colonialism. And as you'd expect, Britain did not take it well. The process began in earnest after World War I, when the world learned two important things. Empires were expensive. Colonized people could fight, and did. Indian, African, and Caribbean soldiers had fought and died in British uniforms, defending freedoms they themselves didn't have. After the war, they returned home not to thanks, but to the same old imperial grind, no rights, no respect, and no real intention of change. It was the sort of hypocrisy that planted the seeds of revolt across the globe. Then came World War II, and Britain took another hammering. Cities bombed, economy gutted, national pride shaken. And suddenly, holding on to colonies was less about profit and more about stubborn habit, like keeping a storage unit you can't afford, just because your grandfather put stuff in it. The face of resistance was changing too. No more just spears and uprisings. Now there were boycotts, marches, and one man in particular, who turned non-violence into a political earthquake. Mohandas Gandhi, armed with little more than a homespun shawl and the world's most passive-aggressive stare, Gandhi led India's independence movement with relentless discipline. His tactics included refusing to buy British goods, refusing to pay British taxes, making his own salt just to annoy the viceroy. The Salt March of 1930 was emblematic. Gandhi and his followers walked 240 miles to the sea to harvest salt illegally, breaking a British monopoly. It was brilliant, it was petty, and it was televised. Okay, not literally, but the international press loved it. Suddenly, imperialism didn't look like civilization. It looked like an old man being beaten for holding salt. And while Gandhi preached non-violence, others began organizing in new ways too. Political parties, labor unions, underground presses. The empire had trained a generation of clerks and lawyers, and now those clerks were writing manifestos, and those lawyers were demanding parliament seats. In 1947, Britain finally agreed to give India independence. The subcontinent rejoiced, but the breakup came with a final catastrophic twist. Partition: India would be divided into two nations, Hindu majority India and Muslim majority Pakistan. It was a rushed, chaotic, bureaucratic nightmare. Lines were drawn on maps by men who had never set foot in the regions they were splitting. Entire communities were bisected, families torn apart. In just a few months, over 15 million people were displaced, and at least 1 million died in the violence that followed. Leaving the empire was like pulling out a sword, dramatic, bloody, and somehow still not clean. And this wasn't an isolated case. Palestine, handed back with confusion and violence. Kenya, bloody Mau Mau rebellion followed by a slow-motion exit. Cyprus, explosions and negotiations. Malaya, guerrilla warfare, emergency laws, and eventual retreat. In some cases, Britain tried to delay the inevitable by propping up friendly elites, rigging elections, or writing constitutions from afar. But the truth was simple. The empire couldn't hold on. Too costly, too unpopular, too morally indefensible in the age of self-determination. Even as the empire shrank, British politicians often clung to illusions. They spoke of a commonwealth, a nice way of saying, "We used to own you, now we just invite you to tea and pretend it's friendly." But for former colonies, independence didn't mean instant utopia. Many faced post-colonial chaos. Ethnic tensions exacerbated by colonial divide and rule strategies. Economies designed for export, not self-sufficiency. Infrastructure that served ports, not people. And most tragically, violence. Civil wars, military coups, border conflicts, all echoes of empire's hasty exits and artificial boundaries. In some places, statues of Queen Victoria were torn down. In others, they were just ignored, a quiet reminder of who used to be in charge and how little they're missed. Independence brought pride, yes, but also struggle. The challenge of reclaiming identity after generations of being told your own history wasn't worth writing. The British Empire may be gone, but its fingerprints are everywhere. Legal systems shaped by colonial codes, languages imposed by British school teachers, cities still bearing names like Port Victoria or Georgetown, and of course cricket, played with inexplicable passion by nations once conquered by a people who insisted rain made it more exciting. Some former colonies have flourished. Others still wrestle with the scars of imperialism. Borders that don't make sense, economies that depend on exports they don't control, and leaders trained in the very systems they once opposed. So, while the British Empire officially dissolved, it didn't really vanish. It left behind a world remade in its image, sometimes functional, often fractured, and almost always more complex than the empire's own simplistic vision of civilizing. The empire didn't collapse with a bang. It crumbled under its own contradictions, dragged down by protest, poverty, and the cold, hard truth that you can't rule the world forever, just because you really like maps and marmalade. The sun may have finally set on the British Empire, but its long, awkward shadow still stretches across the globe, like an uninvited uncle who won't leave the wedding reception. Independence was declared, flags were lowered, and empire officials packed their monocles and gin. But what they left behind wasn't exactly a clean slate. Colonialism, it turns out, is the kind of roommate that moves out, but leaves their stuff everywhere. Borders, laws, languages, institutions, educational systems, and even sports, all marked by a very specific kind of British logic: neat handwriting, rigid hierarchy, and the belief that toast solves most problems. The British may have left, but they took the loot, the language, and your great-granddad's statue. Let's start with borders, because nothing says legacy of empire like a map that looks like it was drawn during an earthquake. The British didn't just carve up the world, they did it with a ruler and a deadline. Lines were drawn across deserts, jungles, and entire civilizations, often by men who thought local context was an optional extra. Take Africa. Colonial borders ignored ethnic, linguistic, and cultural realities, smashing rival groups into artificial states while splitting communities into different countries. The result: ongoing conflicts, secessionist movements, and enough diplomatic tension to power a mid-level Bond villain. Or South Asia. The partition of India and Pakistan still reverberates in politics, identity, and the shared trauma of a rushed, bloody divorce. And the Middle East. You can thank British promises, maps, and a fondness for vague agreements for a century's worth of geopolitical migraines. Then there's the English language, once a colonial imposition, now the world's favourite second language, international business dialect, and reluctant karaoke option. It's the legacy of empire wrapped in a thesaurus. Today, over 2 billion people speak English to some degree, often better than the British themselves, who are still debating whether aluminium has too many syllables. In former colonies, English often became the official language, not because it was beloved, but because it was the only way anyone from the north, south, and east could understand the bureaucrats in the capital. It was the empire's parting gift. Confusion, but in Queen's English. And let's not forget the legal systems still based on British common law, complete with wigs in court, ceremonial language, and enough archaic procedures to make a Dickens novel look efficient. Many former colonies retained these frameworks not because they worked perfectly, but because replacing them was harder than just hoping the paperwork eventually sorted itself out. The empire also left behind economic dependencies. Many colonies were restructured to serve British industrial needs, exporting raw materials, importing finished goods. That setup didn't magically vanish after independence. Infrastructure had been built to move tea and tin, not develop local economies. So when the British left, many nations were handed the keys to a car with no engine, 4 flat tyres, and a steering wheel that still pointed toward London. And trade. Well, if you were once part of the empire, chances are your biggest trading partner for decades was the very country that had colonized you. It's the economic version of Stockholm Syndrome, only with tariffs. Add to that resource extraction, where British companies kept operating in former colonies long after the ink on the independence documents dried. Oil, gold, diamonds. The empire might have packed up, but the multinational corporations it bred stuck around like relatives who only show up when they smell inheritance money. Of course, Britain didn't want to let go entirely, hence the Commonwealth, a club for former colonies, and a few extras, where everyone pretends it's not weird that the host used to rule over half the room. It's the political equivalent of a family reunion, where everyone agrees not to talk about that one incident with the global exploitation. The Commonwealth promotes cooperation, trade, and cricket tournaments. Occasionally, it tries to address historical grievances, and occasionally, it remembers that most of those grievances are still ongoing. And then there's royal nostalgia. Queen Elizabeth was head of state for 15 countries at her death. King Charles II still appears on coins in places he's never governed. It's like watching a reality TV spin-off you didn't sign up for, but still shows up on your feed every week. No Imperial hangover is more literal than the British Museum, which could be more accurately renamed Things We Took While Smiling. From the Rosetta Stone to the Benin bronzes, the museum holds a staggering number of artifacts that were, well, borrowed permanently. The defense? We're keeping them safe, which translated means we took your sacred statue, put it next to a gift shop, and now school children walk past it holding juice boxes. Repatriation efforts are ongoing and contentious. Every year, another country asks for something back. Every year the museum explains, in increasingly elaborate curatorial language, why no is the more historically accurate answer. And finally, let's talk cricket. The empire's most enduring cultural export, other than awkward small talk and deep-rooted class anxiety. Cricket was once a tool of imperial control, teaching colonized subjects the virtues of discipline, hierarchy and fair play, usually while losing to white men in white hats. But the best plot twist in colonial history? The colonized got really good at it. Today, teams from India, Pakistan, the West Indies, and South Africa routinely beat England at the very game it used to teach them obedience. It's justice, with a bat and a scoreboard. So what's left of the empire today? Well, quite a lot, actually. Borders drawn in imperial ink. Languages still whispered in courtrooms and classrooms. Museums filled with the world's misplaced heritage. A commonwealth held together by politeness and passive aggression. And a planet full of countries still untangling the economic, cultural and political knots left behind by men in red wool coats and questionable facial hair. The empire may be gone, but its footprints are everywhere, not just in the soil but in the systems, the minds and the memory of nations that were told they needed civilizing. And somewhere, someone's still waiting for their statue back. Long before Ferdinand Magellan ever dreamed of circumnavigating the globe or dying before finishing it, he was just a scrappy Portuguese noble with a map, a chip on his shoulder, and an unhealthy fascination with spice. Born in 1480, in the charmingly unpronounceable town of Sabrosa, Portugal, Magellan came from a noble family. But, crucially, the kind of nobility that earned respect, but didn't come with an inheritance. Think aristocrat on a budget. His parents had connections to the Portuguese royal court, which got young Ferdinand a gig as a page to Queen Leonor, basically the 15th century version of an unpaid internship with decent cloaks. There, surrounded by books, charts and sailors who probably smelled like salted despair, Magellan's imagination lit up. He studied cartography, astronomy, and the fine art of standing dramatically next to globes. This was the age of discovery, when Europeans believed that if they could sail far enough, they'd either fall off the edge of the world or land somewhere full of pepper and people to colonize. Portugal, at this point, was Europe's GPS system. They'd rounded the Cape of Good Hope, mapped huge chunks of Africa, and reached India. The Portuguese crown had more explorers than it knew what to do with, most of them fueled by equal parts ambition and salted cod. Magellan desperately wanted in, and so, at the age of 25, he got his first taste of overseas adventure by joining an expedition to India as part of the Portuguese Armada. This wasn't your luxury cruise. The seas were rough, the work was grueling, and hygiene was more of a suggestion than a practice. But Magellan was tough. He proved himself in battle, absorbed knowledge like a sponge in a hurricane, and kept dreaming of routes others hadn't dared to take. Next up, Morocco, where he fought in one of Portugal's many attempts to hold on to forts and trading posts along the North African coast. It was here that he was wounded, a serious leg injury that would leave him with a permanent limp and a personality that, let's say, didn't mellow with age. Back home, he asked for a raise, or recognition, or, anything. Portugal responded with a resounding no. Despite his experience, Magellan was passed over for promotions. Worse, he was accused of illegal trading with the Moors, a charge he insisted was nonsense. But the damage was done. The royal court basically ghosted him. And in the world of 16th century maritime politics, if your own country ignores you, there's always someone else willing to fund your dangerous ideas. When Portugal said no, Magellan said fine, and immediately offered to sail the planet for their biggest rival. Magellan packed up his maps, limped across the border, and walked straight into the court of King Charles I of Spain, a teenage monarch who would later become Emperor Charles V, and whose chin could have ruled its own empire. Now for context. Spain and Portugal were the Beyoncé and Taylor Swift of exploration, incredibly powerful, intensely competitive, and not above a little shade. The Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494, had split the non-European world between them like a medieval divorce settlement. Portugal got the east, Spain got the west, and everyone else got seasick. Magellan had a pitch. If he could reach the fabled Spice Islands, modern-day Maluku Islands in Indonesia, by sailing west, he could claim them for Spain, without violating the treaty. Technically, he said, they might fall on Spain's side of the globe if you wrapped the map the right way. Sure, no one knew how wide the Pacific was, but details. Charles liked bold ideas, especially ones that annoyed Portugal. He gave Magellan 5 ships, a royal blessing, and a very skeptical Spanish crew. Magellan, now in his late 30s, was about to attempt the most ambitious voyage in history, not because of fame, though that helped, not even for fortune, though he had debts, but because he genuinely believed he could prove the world was rounder, smarter, and better navigated by him. This wasn't a man content with hugging the coastline. This was a man who looked at a globe, squinted, and said, "I bet I can find a shortcut through that." Of course, he was also insufferably confident, not great with interpersonal skills, and as we'll soon see, about to command a fleet full of men who didn't like him, didn't trust him, and in many cases, didn't speak the same language. But for now, he was a man with a plan, 5 ships, and the kind of energy only a betrayed overachiever can summon. And that's how Ferdinand Magellan, Portuguese citizen and professional grudge holder, began the journey that would almost kill everyone, including himself, but also change the map forever. In the 16th century, Europe wasn't just interested in spices, they were acting like medieval spice junkies in need of their next fix. Nutmeg, cinnamon, cloves, pepper, basic kitchen items today. But back then, these were the original luxury goods, the Himalayan pink salt of their time, except people were willing to kill for them, literally. Nutmeg was believed to cure everything from the plague to bad breath. Cloves, magical antiseptic properties. Black pepper, worth its weight in gold. And cinnamon. That was basically dessert and medicine rolled into one aromatic stick. European nobles weren't just seasoning their food, they were basically marinating their egos. Europeans wanted nutmeg so badly, they were willing to sail off the map and hope not to die. And where did all this flavor come from? A tiny speck on the map, the Spice Islands, aka the Maluku Islands, in modern-day Indonesia. These volcanic pearls in the Pacific were the sole source of several prized spices, and they were as inaccessible as they were aromatic. Naturally, every major European power wanted them, but preferably without paying middlemen. At the time, the dominant route was through the Middle East and overland via Arab and Venetian traders. The spices made the journey, but by the time they reached European tables, prices had inflated so much you needed a crown or a very successful robbery career to afford a pepper grinder. So Portugal went east, sailing around Africa to reach India and beyond. They built forts, made diplomatic deals with cannons, and gradually secured a foothold in the spice trade. Spain, meanwhile, had a problem. Portugal owned the East and treaties said they couldn't mess with that. Enter the Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494 and overseen by a pope, who probably just wanted everyone to stop yelling. The treaty divided the world outside Europe between Portugal and Spain, along a line drawn about 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. That's right. They sliced the entire planet in half with the cartographic precision of a pizza cutter. Portugal got everything to the east, Africa, India, the Spice Islands, and Spain got everything to the west, the Americas, and our ocean. The problem? No one knew how big the Earth actually was. They just assumed you could wrap the map like a globe, and everything would work out fine. It was the cartographic equivalent of guessing someone's birthday by looking at their shoes. This is where Ferdinand Magellan's mental light bulb flickered on. Magellan knew from experience that going east to get spices meant dealing with Portugal, who now viewed him as something between a traitor and a particularly annoying ghost. So instead, he came up with a new pitch. What if you could reach the Spice Islands by going west, around the Americas, through some as yet undiscovered passage, across what he assumed would be a small sea, collect spices, claim them for Spain, get paid, retire, easy. He even had a map, well, sort of. Maps in the early 1500s were optimistic. They were a combination of ancient theories, sailor gossip, and outright guesswork. Sure, they showed landmasses and coastlines, but they also included things like sea monsters, dragons, and islands that didn't exist. According to most charts at the time, the Pacific Ocean was barely wider than a bay, and if you just kept going west long enough, you'd bump into Asia. Eventually, Magellan truly believed he could reach the Maluku Islands and prove they lay within Spain's half of the globe. His plan relied on math. Not good math, not correct math, but math nonetheless. He used the latest geographic estimates from Europe's finest thinkers, most of whom were just guessing while wearing very serious robes. Unfortunately, They'd underestimated the Earth's circumference by thousands of miles, and had no idea just how much ocean sat between the Americas and Asia. But Magellan didn't know that. Or maybe he did, and just refused to care. Either way, he was all in. Spain, enticed by the promise of breaking Portugal's spice monopoly, decided to fund the voyage. King Charles I likely thought, well, we'll either get spices or get rid of Magellan. Win-win. Magellan's voyage wasn't just a naval expedition, it was a bet against the known world. He was daring reality itself to blink. Of course, he didn't share every detail with his mostly Spanish crew, who had a lot of questions, like, how far is this voyage? Do we know where we're going? Wait, this guy's Portuguese? Magellan answered most of those questions with confident silence and a deeply concerning smile. And so, 5 ships, hundreds of men, and one deeply speculative map set out to reach the east by sailing directly into the unknown west. Because nothing says reliable navigation like being pretty sure the ocean's not that big. So there he was, Ferdinand Magellan, newly unemployed, proudly limping and radiating "I'll prove you wrong" energy like a man who'd just been rejected by his high school crush, and was now determined to become CEO of planet Earth. Having been snubbed by Portugal, he crossed the Iberian Peninsula to Spain, not just to start over, but to launch the most ambitious stunt in early modern navigation, reach the east by going west. At the time, Spain's King Charles I was just 18 years old, technically a man, legally a monarch, and emotionally still trying to figure out which fork to use at state dinners. He would later become Emperor Charles I, ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, but back then he was just a Habsburg with a vast inheritance and an appetite for global domination. Magellan arrived at court in 1517 with 2 things, a bold plan and a Portuguese accent. This was not an immediate advantage. Spain and Portugal were fierce rivals, especially when it came to maritime exploration. Asking Spain to trust a Portuguese captain was like asking Coke to hire Pepsi's ex-marketing manager to design their next billboard. To strengthen his case, Magellan partnered with Rui Falero, a fellow Portuguese navigator and human migraine generator, who could do celestial calculations but had all the social skills of a wet sock. Together, they made a great team. One had the big idea, the other could prove it with numbers, and neither could charm a dinner party to save their lives. But they had one golden pitch: spices, glory, and salvation, all in one westward trip. They promised that the Spice Islands, the prize everyone was fighting over, actually lay in Spain's half of the world, as per the Treaty of Tordesillas. They argued that if they reached the islands by going west, and proved they were in Spanish territory, Spain could legally break Portugal's monopoly and set up shop. That meant wealth, power, and perhaps, most importantly, annoying Portugal. Convincing Spain to fund your dream was easy. Just promise spices, and definitely don't mention the dying part. Of course, they left out a few key points. They didn't actually know how wide the Pacific was. They weren't sure if a westward passage existed. And yes, they might all die horribly, but imagine the trade profits. Still, Charles I was intrigued. He consulted his advisors, who were divided. Some loved the idea of outflanking Portugal, others were deeply suspicious of Magellan's true loyalties, and at least one guy probably just nodded through the whole thing because he didn't want to look dumb. In the end, Charles was swayed. He agreed to finance the expedition, not because it was guaranteed to succeed, but because it might, and because having a globe-spanning empire sounded way cooler than just ruling over castles and goats. The deal was inked in 1518, and it was generous. Magellan was granted 5 ships: Trinidad, San Antonio, Concepcion, Victoria, and Santiago. He was promised a hefty portion of the profits from any trade he established. He was granted titles, lands, and the right to govern whatever he discovered. Red, claimed for Spain with flags and paperwork. And just to keep things awkward, he had to include Spanish officers who outranked him on paper, but not in actual command. From the start, this was a walking HR disaster. The Spanish captains distrusted Magellan. The crew, mostly Spanish, with a few Italians, Flemings, and vaguely desperate souls, weren't exactly thrilled about taking orders from a guy with a funny accent and a habit of staring at the stars like they owed him money. Magellan also made a classic leadership mistake. He didn't bother to explain much. He kept his navigation plans to himself, didn't reveal the full route, and maintained an air of cryptic confidence that only made people more nervous. But he was confident, probably too confident. He believed so fully in his mission that he ignored every red flag, political infighting, vague maps, the Atlantic hurricane season, and the fact that 3 of his captains already wanted to mutiny before they even left port. Still, when the fleet finally launched from Seville in 1519, it was a triumph. People gathered to watch. Bells rang. Flags waved. The Spanish crown had just bet big on a voyage that could change history, or at least give Portugal a really awkward Tuesday. As the ship sailed down the Guadalquivir River and out to the Atlantic, Magellan stood on the deck of the Trinidad, silently calculating routes, currents, and how long it would take to go down in the history books. What he didn't know was that history had already written the ending, and he wouldn't be there to see it. By the time September 20th, 1519, rolled around, Ferdinand Magellan's voyage was ready to set sail, and by ready we mean held together by rope, resentment, and the vague hope that everyone would at least wait a week before starting a mutiny. The Spanish crown had given Magellan 5 ships to command, each with its own charming name and grim destiny. First up was the Trinidad, Magellan's flagship, his pride and joy, and the ship where all the passive-aggressive commanding would take place. Then there was the San Antonio, the largest of the fleet, which will go ahead and flag early as plot twist incoming. Next, Concepcion and Victoria, smaller but still respectable. And finally, Santiago, the runt of the litter, whose upcoming fate can only be described as wet and disappointing. Each ship was loaded with supplies, charts, and an alarming quantity of salted meat that was indistinguishable from shoe leather, even before it rotted. The plan was simple: sail to South America, find a strait to the Pacific, cross the ocean, grab spices, and return in glory. What could go wrong? Well, everything. It was less a naval expedition, more floating HR disaster with sails. To understand how fragile this voyage was from the start, we need to talk about the people. Magellan's crew was an international buffet of ambition, desperation, and wildly conflicting goals. The total headcount came in at around 270 men, but men may be generous. The crew included experienced sailors and navigators who knew the seas, soldiers with absolutely no naval experience, clerics, hoping to convert locals and survive, a few educated men like Antonio Pigafetta, the expedition's scribe and unofficial drama recorder, and a healthy serving of criminals, debt dodgers, and guys who answered yes to the question want to see the world and possibly die of scurvy. Let's not forget this was pre-LinkedIn. Background checks were basically, do you have arms? Great, you're hired. The officers, however, were the real tension powder keg. Magellan, a Portuguese captain in charge of a Spanish fleet, immediately faced suspicion. The Spanish crown had insisted he include Spanish captains on each ship, to support him. But most of these men loathed him before the first anchor lifted. The biggest thorn in his side, Juan de Cartagena, captain of the San Antonio, and a man who would have challenged a sunrise if Magellan said it looked nice. Cartagena considered himself co-equal in rank, refused to acknowledge Magellan's command, and exuded the energy of someone who'd absolutely write long passive-aggressive emails in today's workplace. Then there was Gaspar de Quesada, who would later become Cartagena's co-conspirator in one of the least successful coup attempts of the 16th century. These weren't bold explorers. They were bureaucrats in breastplates, offended that they had to take orders from a Portuguese outsider with a limp and a god complex. Meanwhile, Magellan didn't exactly help matters. His leadership style was a toxic blend of I know what I'm doing, and I'm not telling you anything. He kept the voyage's details close to the chest, shared almost no navigational plans, and mostly barked orders with the cheery warmth of a damp cannonball. Despite all this awkwardness, or perhaps because of it, the expedition left the port of San Lucar de Barrameda to great fanfare. Trumpets blared, crowds waved, and Magellan stared at the horizon like he owed it money. Almost immediately, the problems began. The ships were not in top shape. The crew's morale was shakier than a sailor with one leg on a rolling deck. Language barriers caused confusion. And while Magellan was obsessed with reaching the Spice Islands, most of his men weren't even clear where the islands were. When Pigafetta later wrote about the voyage, he made it clear that Magellan seemed to be the only one who fully believed in the mission. Everyone else was just hoping there'd be rum. The fleet hugged the coast of Africa before crossing the Atlantic to Brazil. Along the way, they faced storms, doldrums, and one very awkward moment where a ship had to be towed because someone forgot to pack enough sails. At several stops, Cartagena and the Spanish officers accidentally ignored Magellan's orders, which was kind of like telling your Uber driver you'd rather take the wheel for a bit, yet somehow they kept sailing. Magellan clung to command with the strength of a man who had everything to prove. He was outnumbered, out-hated, and probably starting to realize just how long this shortcut to the Spice Islands was going to take. Still, his will held, for now. What began as a majestic maritime mission had already devolved into a nautical power struggle, and the Pacific, still thousands of miles away, the 5 ships drifted westward, dragged by the wind, powered by salted meat, and captained by a man whose dream was just beginning, and whose nightmare was getting ready to show up with knives. By the time Magellan's expedition crept down the coast of South America, it had stopped feeling like a voyage of discovery, and started resembling a very long group therapy session, where no one spoke the same language, and someone kept threatening to stab the therapist. The year was 1520. The fleet had already crossed the Atlantic and landed in Brazil, which was scenic, lush, and entirely unhelpful for finding the mysterious westward passage to the Spice Islands, so they kept sailing south, and colder south. Every day brought more wind, more mist, and more reminders that no one had packed for Patagonia. Nothing says bold explorations like freezing to death while looking for nutmeg. The further south they went, the less it looked like adventure, and the more it resembled a survival challenge, sponsored by God's worst mood. Patagonia in winter is not gentle. It is a wind-blown, glacier-smacked, morale-crushing expanse where trees are scarce, food is scarcer, and hope is a rumor you heard back in Lisbon. To make matters worse, the crew had no idea how much longer this would take. Remember, Magellan never told anyone the full plan. So now they were cold, hungry, underinformed, and trapped in a wooden boat that smelled like feet and existential dread. Enter Port St. Julian. Here, in a lonely, wind-battered harbour on Argentina's southern coast, Magellan made the call to winter. Wintering is a nice way of saying, let's park the ships before we all die. They would stay put for several months, build temporary shelters, and wait for weather that didn't actively want them dead. This was when the the craters in the chain of command erupted. 3 of Magellan's captains, Cartagena, Quesada, and Mendoza, had had enough. Enough of Magellan's secrecy, enough of the cold, enough of following a Portuguese man into what looked suspiciously like a frozen death trap at the bottom of the world. And so, they did what any overconfident 16th century nobleman with trust issues would do. They mutinied. One night, they took over 3 of the 5 ships, San Antonio, Victoria, and Concepcion. Magellan, caught by surprise, had only his flagship Trinidad and the tiny Santiago, but while he may have been limping, he was not about to let anyone steal his spice-flavoured thunder. Over the next few days, Magellan pulled off what could only be described as mutiny judo. Through a combination of bluffing, ship repositioning, well-timed cannon fire, and some masterclass level diplomacy, the kind that ends in people being stabbed, he regained control. Mendoza was executed on the spot. Quesada was tried, beheaded, and quartered. Cartagena, ever the slippery one, was spared execution and marooned, left alone on the coast with a Bible and the worst Yelp rating in history. Leadership tip: nothing boosts morale like publicly beheading your co-workers. It was brutal, but it worked. The mutiny was crushed. Authority was re-established, and Magellan made it clear the next man who challenged his command would be using his neck for science class. Of course, morale didn't exactly rebound. The crew, already miserable, was now terrified. They weren't sure which was worse, the ocean or their own captain, but the weather didn't care. Winds howled, frostbite nibbled, and the real kicker, they were stuck eating whatever they could scavenge, penguins which they called strange geese, salted meat gone suspiciously soft, and hardtack so full of weevils it technically counted as protein. Then came the cherry on this frozen Sunday, the loss of the Santiago. While anchored at Port St. Julian, Magellan sent the Santiago on a scouting mission southward. It never made it back. The ship was caught in a storm, wrecked, and abandoned. Miraculously, the crew survived and made a grueling overland trek back to the fleet, looking like damp ghosts and smelling like every bad decision combined. One ship down, supplies running low, mutiny still fresh in the salty air, and they hadn't even found the Pacific yet. But Magellan remained steadfast. He believed, with alarming intensity, that the passage was real, that the ocean lay just beyond one more headland, that he wasn't dragging everyone into a frosty hellscape for nothing. His men, they weren't so sure, but they were stuck, literally and legally. So when spring returned and the weather softened, the remaining 4 ships unfurled their sails once more and turned further south. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to enter the strait, and beyond that, a sea so vast and empty, it made Patagonia feel cozy. After months of cold feet, frost-bitten tempers, and a little light mutiny, Ferdinand Magellan finally approached the one thing that had haunted explorers' dreams for decades: the Western Passage, that mythical back door from the Atlantic to the Pacific, the holy grail of spice-inspired navigation. And spoiler alert, it was not a straight line. It was October 1520, and the weather was just beginning to shift from murderous blizzard to perpetual wet disappointment. Magellan and the 3 remaining ships, Trinidad, Victoria, and Conception, crept down the ragged coastline of southern South America, every sailor leaning off the deck, squinting at cliffs like, is that it, or is that just more land pretending to be a passage? On October 21st, they found it, a narrow opening between high, jagged cliffs, where the ocean funneled inward with a deceptive stillness. This was the entrance to what would one day bear Magellan's name, the Strait of Magellan, but at the time, it might as well have been called the Strait of Please Don't Crashes, because what followed was one of the most harrowing navigation experiences of the entire voyage. Magellan found the passage west, and it only cost him half his fleet and most of his optimism. The strait was not a simple waterway. It was a 350-mile serpentine death trap of swirling currents, narrow inlets, misleading channels, and cliffs that loomed like judgmental grandparents. Every turn looked promising, until it dead-ended or tried to swallow a ship whole. It was like trying to parallel park 5 galleons in a mountain stream during an earthquake. Magellan split the fleet up to scout various branches of the channel. That's when things started falling apart again, because of course they did. Let's talk about the San Antonio. Yes, you're thinking, wait, didn't that one mutiny already? Oh yes, the San Antonio was the drama queen of the fleet. Technically, it had been returned to the fold after the mutiny at Port San Julian, but the crew had remained about as loyal as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. While the fleet cautiously explored the labyrinth of the strait, Magellan made the mistake of sending the San Antonio ahead on a recon mission. It promptly did what it had always secretly wanted to do. It bailed. One dark night, without a word, the San Antonio turned around, sailed east, and booked it back to Spain. You can almost hear the collective sigh of betrayal echo through the Patagonian cliffs. When it returned home in 1521, the crew had the goal to claim Magellan was dead and that the mission had failed, conveniently forgetting to mention the whole "we snuck away in the night because we didn't want to die in a cold puddle" part. Back in the strait, Magellan didn't yet know they'd deserted. He just knew they were missing. He pressed on with the remaining 3 ships. Navigating the strait took over a month, and it was anything but peaceful. The ships faced icy winds, confusing forks in the water, violent tides, and the very real danger of running aground. Lookouts strained to see around each corner. Crews stood ready to drop anchor at a moment's notice, and Magellan, haunted by the ghosts of his mutinous past, and now literally down 40% of his fleet, stared grimly at the maps and the clouds, muttering celestial coordinates like a man reciting a very angry prayer. But on November 28th, 1520, they emerged. After weeks of anxiety, suspense, and accidental scenic tours of dead-end inlets, the remaining 3 ships exited the strait and found themselves in an ocean so vast and still that Magellan named it Mar Pacifico, the peaceful sea. Peaceful, sure. If by peaceful you mean deceptively vast, empty, and wildly underprovisioned for. But for that brief moment, Magellan stood at the bow of the Trinidad, gazing out at an ocean no European had crossed before. He had done it. He had found the way west. The shortcut was real. The Spice Islands, he believed, were now within reach. Of course, no one mentioned that the Pacific was approximately twice as large as anyone had guessed, and would soon reveal itself as the least peaceful part of this whole expedition. Still, this was a moment of triumph. Despite mutinies, betrayal, wrecked ships, and months of enduring weather conditions that could be described as penguin adjacent, Magellan had discovered a new route between the Atlantic and Pacific, a feat that would reshape world maps forever. He didn't know about the San Antonio's betrayal yet. He didn't know about the hell awaiting him in the Pacific, and he certainly didn't know that the trip would ultimately cost him his life. But for now, he had done it. He'd found the way through, and the crew, they celebrated with a mix of awe, relief, and the gnawing realization that they still had no idea how far they had to go, and almost no food left. Welcome to the Pacific. Ferdinand Magellan had just pulled off the greatest navigational flex of the 16th century. He found the elusive Western Passage, and for his reward, a months-long soul-crushing sail across the largest body of water on the planet, completely unprepared, with no GPS, no fresh food, and morale lower than the rat population, which was rapidly becoming part of the menu. Welcome to the Pacific Ocean, a sea so vast and empty, it made the Atlantic look like a kiddie pool. Magellan named it Mar Pacifico, or Peaceful Sea, because at first, the waters were unusually calm, which sounds lovely, until you realize nothing else was. They crossed the world's largest ocean using dead reckoning and blind hope, and neither was very alive by the end. Here's the thing. Magellan had no idea just how big the Pacific was. The maps of the time were less accurate geographic tools and more vague artistic guesses. He estimated it would take maybe a few weeks to cross. Instead, it took them over 3 months, 98 days of blue nothingness, broken only by the occasional hallucination or sea shanty, performed through clenched teeth. They expected to see islands. They didn't, not for weeks. And the ones they did find? Too small, too barren, or too hostile to stop at. At one point, they landed at an island, only to find it completely uninhabited. Even the coconuts seemed to have skipped town, so they kept sailing. Now we get to the culinary low point of the expedition, which is saying a lot, considering the hardtack had already turned into a playground for weevils back in the Atlantic. After weeks at sea, the fresh food was gone. The salted meat had spoiled into something that could legally be classified as a war crime, and the water, it had turned green, chunky, and deeply philosophical, as in, drinking it made you question the point of existence. The solution? Get creative. They ate rats, sold at high prices, and eaten whole. Sawdust, boiled into a kind of desperate soup. Old leather, scraped off ropes, and boiled into something with the texture of sadness. And yes, the ever-iconic hardtack, now so riddled with insects. It was basically a protein bar, if you squinted and cried hard enough. Scurvy, the pirate's plague, hit the fleet like an uninvited cannonball. Without vitamin C, men's gums swelled, their teeth fell out, and their bodies slowly broke down. By the end of the crossing, dozens were dead, and most of the survivors looked less like sailors and more like walking skeletons on strike. Pigafetta, our trusty on-board chronicler, described it with disturbing clarity. Men dying not in storms, not in battle, but of nothing, of hunger, of rot, of boredom, so deep it cracked the soul, and through it all, the ocean stayed calm, a serene blue monster, slowly digesting the dreams of empire. As for steering across this blue abyss, Magellan had no landmarks, no islands, no idea how far they still had to go. They used dead reckoning, which basically meant estimating their position based on speed and direction, something that worked great until you had to guess across an entire hemisphere. Magellan, always tight-lipped, didn't share navigation data with his captains, which did wonders for trust and exactly nothing for morale. They were literally lost at sea, and the only guy who maybe knew where they were going wasn't talking. Still, the ships held, the wind favored them, and despite everything, rats, scurvy, mystery soup, psychological collapse, they pressed on. After 3 straight months of oceanic purgatory, they spotted land. It was Guam, and the men reportedly wept. You would too if you hadn't seen a tree that wasn't trying to kill you in 90 days. But relief didn't last long. Upon arriving at Guam, the locals approached the ships and took a few items, ropes, tools, maybe a knife or two. The crew called it theft. The The locals probably thought it was barter. Magellan responded by burning an entire village, thus setting the tone for most of European-Pacific relations moving forward. From there, they sailed on to the Philippines, where Magellan finally found warmth, rest. Well, we'll get to that in the next chapter. The Pacific crossing nearly broke them. Of the 3 remaining ships, dozens of men had died, and many others would never fully recover. Magellan had proven the ocean could be crossed, but also that nature didn't care how noble your mission was. The Pacific gave them peace in name only. What it really offered was a slow, quiet, existential gut punch. But they had done it. They had reached Asia from the west. They were alive. Well, most of them. Sort of. After 98 straight days of what can only be described as an all-inclusive nightmare cruise across the Pacific, Magellan's crew had reached the breaking point. The men were gaunt, toothless, hallucinating about cheese, and seriously debating whether boiled rope counted as dinner. So when someone on lookout shouted land on March 6th, 1521, they didn't just celebrate, they wept. That land was Guam, part of the Mariana Islands, and to the starving, scurvy-ridden sailors, it looked like Eden with better weather and fewer rats. Palm trees, people, real coconuts, possibly not dying. The men practically fell out of the ships, trying to get ashore. But what started as a heartwarming tale of survival quickly turned into a diplomatic fireball, because nothing says, thanks for the hospitality, like pointing a cannon at someone's hut. Magellan's idea of cultural exchange was, we trade you mirrors, you give us coconuts, and nobody gets cannoned. The local Chamorro people were curious and welcoming. They paddled out in small canoes, offering food, fresh water, and island-made goods. The crew, thrilled not to be eating their belts, immediately began bartering, mostly using shiny European trinkets, mirrors, beads, bells, and that universal symbol of goodwill, pants that no longer fit because of dramatic starvation. But here's where things went sideways. The Chamorro people had a very different understanding of property. In their culture, items were freely taken or traded between visitors and locals, kind of a we're all in this island together vibe. So when they saw tools, ropes, and even a skiff left unattended on the European ships, they helped themselves. From their perspective, polite borrowing. From Magellan's perspective, theft of the century. Cue the overreaction. Magellan, never one to let cultural nuance get in the way of a good show of force, decided that borrowed ropes warranted military intervention. He armed a landing party, marched ashore, and promptly burned an entire Chamorro village to the ground, killing several locals and taking others hostage. So, yeah, awkward. And it didn't stop there. To make his point absolutely clear, Magellan sent word through translators that the locals could return the allegedly stolen goods, or he'd unleash more God's justice via musket and cannon. The Chamorros, understandably confused, but also wishing to avoid becoming barbecued history, returned most of the items and offered even more gifts in hopes of de-escalation. Trade resumed, kind of, sort of, very awkwardly. On the bright side, the crew got what they desperately needed: fresh fruit, fish, coconuts, and clean water. The island became a brief oasis, even as the underlying tension hummed like a powder keg in a tea shop. Some sailors recorded that the locals seemed friendly again. Others noted they were keeping a very careful distance and avoiding eye contact like teenagers who just dented Dad's car. Guam was the first encounter with a new culture since leaving South America, and it set the tone for what Magellan's crew considered normal interaction moving forward, which is to say, show up, assume everyone's thrilled to see you, fire cannons if they aren't. This kind of weaponized hospitality would become a hallmark of European exploration for centuries. Bring religion, mirrors, and guns. If people like the mirrors, great. If they don't, well, there's always the guns. In Magellan's case, it was less about conquest and more about control. After losing one ship, being abandoned by another, and nearly starving to death, he was in no mood for ambiguity. He wanted cooperation, respect, and coconuts, in that order. The Chamorros, meanwhile, just wanted their village not on fire. After a few days of repairs, provisioning, and very strained island diplomacy, Magellan's fleet, now down to 3 ships and a crew that looked like the cast of a ghost story, sailed westward once more. They left behind a smoking village, a bruised first contact, and a textbook example of how not to introduce yourself to a new culture. But they also left healthier, fed, and slightly more hydrated than before. Small wins. The fleet's next stop would be the Philippines, where Magellan hoped to rest, resupply, convert some locals, and finally lay the groundwork for reaching the Spice Islands. He did not know that he had already entered the final leg of his life, and that his quest for glory would end with a spear, a beach, and a very unfortunate power play. But for now, the ships creaked westward, heavier with food, lighter on morality, and absolutely committed to finishing what they started, even if their captain didn't make it to the finish line. After surviving starvation, scurvy, betrayal, and the Pacific Ocean's version of solitary confinement, Magellan and his battered fleet limped into the Philippines in March of 1521. You'd think after all that the man would take a well-earned nap and maybe a sabbatical, but no. Ferdinand Magellan arrived with big plans, a Bible in one hand and a sword in the other. He was ready to convert some locals, make a few alliances, and casually mold himself into the region's honorary kingmaker, because nothing says rest and recovery like inserting yourself into other people's political problems while dressed like a conquistador with a sunburn. Magellan died doing what he loved, meddling in other people's wars while wildly outnumbered. Magellan landed on Homon Island and was received surprisingly well. The locals were curious, friendly, and impressed by the shiny armor, big ships, and fire-spitting weapons. Soon he made contact with Raja Humabon of Cebu, a local ruler, who realized that befriending a man with cannons might come in handy during neighborhood disputes. Magellan, in turn, saw a golden opportunity to accomplish two things: convert as many people as possible to Christianity, prove to the Spanish crown that he was more than just a navigator. He was a holy hero, part Columbus, part apostle, part uninvited wedding crasher. And so began the mass conversion fest of 1521. On April 14th, Raja Humabon, his wife, and hundreds of islanders were baptized in a grand public ceremony. Magellan was thrilled. To him, this wasn't just a diplomatic win, it was a divine box checked. Bonus points in heaven, maybe even a future statue or two. Definitely a glowing report back to Spain. But then Magellan did what he always did. He overreached. After converting Humabon and his allies, Magellan decided that everyone in the region should be on the Jesus train, especially Lapu-Lapu, the chief of Mactan, a nearby island who had absolutely zero interest in converting, bowing, or being colonized. Magellan's response, not diplomacy, not negotiation, he decided to invade, despite being warned that Lapu-Lapu had hundreds of warriors, and that his own men were exhausted and few. Magellan pulled together a small landing party, about 60 men, and set out for Mactan in the early hours of April 27th, 1521. The plan was simple: march ashore, impress the locals with some divine swagger, fire a few guns in the air, and watch Lapu-Lapu surrender or spontaneously convert. Easy, except it was very not that. Magellan and his men waded ashore at low tide, meaning they had to slog through knee-deep water, in heavy armor, while being pelted with spears, arrows, and sarcasm from Lapu-Lapu's 1,500 warriors. Oh, and their firearms. Pretty useless at that range and in that humidity. So much for cannon-based diplomacy. The locals fought with poison-tipped arrows, bamboo spears, and rocks thrown with deep enthusiasm. Magellan tried to rally his men, but this wasn't a quick skirmish. It was a full-on ambush with the energy of a neighborhood watch that had had enough. He was stabbed multiple times. A spear pierced his leg, and as he tried to stand, someone clubbed him from behind. The crowd closed in. There, in the surf of a beach he didn't need to be on, fighting a war that wasn't his, Magellan died. No glorious last words, no epic send-off. Just a tumble into the shallows, surrounded by people he'd hoped to convert, or at least mildly impress. The surviving crew scrambled back to the boats, dragging their wounded with them, and leaving their leader behind. Ferdinand Magellan, the man who had sailed halfway around the world, discovered the strait, survived the Pacific, and burned at least one village over rope, died trying to convert a guy who simply didn't want to be converted. News of Magellan's death hit the crew hard, mostly in the stomach. Leadership was thrown into chaos. The mission still had to continue, but now without its one-man engine of willpower, navigation, and very questionable judgment. Raja Humabon, the previously baptized ally, suddenly turned much colder. He may have thought twice about helping foreigners who couldn't even win a beach fight. And Lapu-Lapu? He didn't become a king or a Christian, but he did become a Filipino national hero, and rightfully so. He stood his ground against a foreign superpower, using nothing but local loyalty, strategic planning, and a deep unwillingness to be bossed around by someone wearing metal shoes. Magellan, meanwhile, didn't get to finish what he started. He died without reaching the Spice Islands, without circumnavigating the globe, and without ever knowing that his fleet would eventually succeed. But his death marked a turning point. The voyage would go on, but now it was survival mode. Less God, more gold, less glory, more get me home alive. And as for the strait, the Pacific, that huge blue nothingness they just crossed, those were already in the history books. Magellan wouldn't read them, but everyone else would. When Ferdinand Magellan died in knee-deep water on a beach in the Philippines, you'd think that would have been the natural stopping point for his sail around the world ambitions. After all, the guy who started the voyage was now permanently part of a tropical reef, but the expedition didn't die with him. It limped on through backstabbing, storms, starvation, and some of the most painful nautical suffering ever recorded, until, somehow, one ship, the Victoria, dragged its bruised hull back into Spanish waters. And just like that, history had its first circumnavigation of the globe. They started with 5 ships and came back with 1, but hey, it did technically count. After Magellan's death, the leadership baton was less passed and more dropped, fumbled and picked up by Juan Sebastián Elcano, a Basque navigator who didn't set out to make history but just wanted to not die at sea. The remaining crew, now down to about 115 men, had 2 options. Head back the way they came through the Pacific, the Strait of Magellan, and several ghosts. Press onward to the Spice Islands, load up on cargo, and take the long way home, across the Indian Ocean, and around Africa, ideally without getting completely obliterated. They chose option 2, because sure, why not squeeze in a little more trauma? In late 1521, the fleet, now just 2 ships, the Victoria and the Trinidad, finally reached the Moluccas, also known as the Spice Islands, the whole reason this global misadventure started. There, they loaded up with cloves, the 16th century equivalent of solid gold. The crew could practically hear the royal payday jingling in their ears. But nothing ever came easy. The Trinidad sprang leaks, and was forced to stay behind for repairs. Elcano, on the Victoria, decided not to wait. He stuffed the ship full of spices, and left the Trinidad to its soggy fate. Tragically, the Trinidad would later be captured by the Portuguese, and most of its crew either died in prison or vanished into Imperial footnotes. Sailing west across the Indian Ocean in the 16th century was basically an endurance sport, where the prize was not being eaten by your shipmates. The Victoria faced massive storms that nearly ripped the masts clean off, rotting food supplies that made the Pacific meals look gourmet. Scurvy, again because who learns the first time? Crew members died in droves. The barrels of cloves started taking up the space previously occupied by human dignity. Elcano kept going. Not because he was particularly confident, but because turning around would definitely kill them faster. By the time they rounded the Cape of Good Hope in June 1522, the Victoria was more haunted than seaworthy. The sails were patchwork, the hull groaned with every wave, and the crew looked like extras from a zombie film no one wanted to watch. They stopped briefly at the Cape Verde Islands, a Portuguese territory, to try and resupply. But when local officials caught wind that these gaunt, salty skeletons had just smuggled spices out of Portuguese-claimed territory, things got dicey. Several crew members were captured. Elcano, sensing that Portuguese prison was not a fun epilogue, fled with what remained of the Victoria. Finally, on September 6, 1522, after nearly 3 years at sea, the Victoria limped into Sanlúcar de Barrameda, Spain. Of the 270 men who had departed in 1519, only 18 survivors walked ashore. They were sunken-eyed, malnourished, and probably smelled like pickled leather wrapped in regret, but they had done it. They had circumnavigated the globe. Elcano and the crew were greeted with awe, confusion, and a lot of awkward questions like, "Wait, where's Magellan? Why do you smell like a goat exploded? Are those cloves in your boots?" King Charles I welcomed them like semi-triumphant heroes, emphasis on semi. Yes, they brought back priceless spices, Yes, they proved the Earth could be circled by ship, but Spain also learned that the route was long, deadly, and full of political complications. Still, the Victoria's hold was filled with enough cloves to pay for the entire expedition, and then some. So technically worth it. Juan Sebastian Elcano received a coat of arms featuring a globe, and the motto, Primus, circumdiristi me. You were the first to circle me, which is Latin for congrats. You did the thing Magellan couldn't. The voyage changed world history. It proved the planet was round, like people weren't already aware, gave cartographers a lot to update, and kicked off a new age of global trade and global conflict. But the real cost? Nearly every life, 4 lost ships, an ocean full of bones, a beach in the Philippines still echoing with the sound of bad decisions. And yet, despite everything, someone made it home, not Magellan. Not most of the crew, but one ship, the Victoria, the little boat that technically could.